The sky hung above like a slab of lead, suspended just low enough to press on my senses without ever fully descending. Inside the vibrating body of the helicopter, I stared through the foggy window, watching the Gulf of Mexico stretch endlessly in every direction. The sea shifted between blue and gray, its surface unbroken by land, only the occasional ripple hinting at motion beneath. The thrum of the rotor blades pushed against my chest like a second heartbeat. I had flown over deserts, forests, cities, but nothing prepared me for this, an ocean that refused to end. Back in Texas, I had worked on rigs before. I wasn't fresh off training like some greenhorn chasing danger for its own sake. I had experience, a degree in petroleum engineering, and the hardened attitude that came with years of field work. But this assignment was different. The money alone was staggering, nearly double my previous contracts. Yet what unsettled me more was the speed, the way events had unfolded with unsettling urgency, the way the company's recruiters had moved mountains to bring me on board in less than a week. It had felt less like a job offer and more like an enlistment. The rig emerged slowly from the haze as the helicopter began its descent. At first I mistook it for a cargo ship, then some sort of sea fortress. But within seconds, its true shape revealed itself, a sprawling metallic behemoth anchored in the middle of the deep. Towering cranes rotated in synchronized silence, rust-colored pipes wrapped around its central column like arteries. Steel walkways crossed like spider webs above the churning dark. It was neither ship nor shore. It was something else entirely. A city carved out of iron and isolation. The moment the skids touched down, a gust of hot, salt-heavy air swept through the cabin. I stepped out, and the scent of diesel and rust punched me in the face. Beneath my boots, the metal deck hummed with a resonance beyond the rhythm of machines. Something deeper, a vibration that felt almost alive. The entire structure breathed. It breathed through long, mechanical exhales, steady and unnerving. It was less like stepping into a workplace and more like entering the ribs of a beast. A man approached from the far side of the landing pad. He wore a navy blue coverall streaked with oil and time. His gait was firm, but one leg dragged slightly, as if the rig itself had taken its toll. Without introduction, he handed me a pair of thick, yellow-tinted goggles. The lenses were scratched but sturdy, the frame slightly warped. "Put these on. Keep them on, even at night," he said. His voice was sharp, direct. "You'll understand why soon enough." I blinked. I opened my mouth to ask a question, but the man turned and walked away without responding. After a few steps, he stopped and reached into his breast pocket. From it, he produced a sealed envelope, plain and unmarked, the kind used for confidential memos or final warnings. He handed it over. "This is your briefing. Memorize it. Don't ask questions about it. You've already signed everything necessary." I stared at the envelope in my hand, the weight of it oddly disproportionate to its size. I had signed the contract before ever laying eyes on this place, back in a sterile office in Houston, where the recruiter's words had moved faster than my doubt. At the time, the numbers had silenced my caution. Now, standing in the belly of this iron leviathan, I couldn't help but wonder if that decision had been mine at all, or if I had simply stepped into a story already written. The man walked ahead. I fell into step behind him, clutching the envelope. The walkway beneath us clanged with each footfall, a harsh metal echo swallowed by the wind. Around us, workers moved in practiced silence. The mechanical symphony of generators and cranes filled the air, the shriek of gears locked in endless duty. We crossed several junctions, past stairwells leading both up and deep below, until we reached the personnel quarters. As I paused to open the envelope, something in the distance groaned. Not machinery. Something deeper, older. But when I looked up, only the cranes were moving, slow and indifferent. I sat on a metal bench tucked into the corner of the corridor, away from the foot traffic. The envelope crinkled slightly as I tore open its flap and slid out a single sheet of paper. 7 lines greeted me. There was a lack of letterhead and signature, containing only 7 numbered rules, printed in bold type, their austerity more unsettling than any detailed instruction manual. They read like commandments, though no one had called them that. I began reading the first one slowly. 1. Always wear the yellow goggles, even at night. The instruction made me blink. Goggles for nighttime? I expected safety gear, but this felt excessive. Still, I looked at the scratched lenses in my hand and couldn't bring myself to argue. Maybe they knew something I didn't. 2. Never descend to the lowest level alone, especially at night. It struck me as oddly specific. I hadn't even seen the lower levels yet, but the phrasing told me all I needed. Something about that place demanded company, or at least a witness. 3. If you see blood or a bloodstain, do not touch it. Contact the designated unit immediately. Straightforward. Strange, but straightforward. Still, the idea that blood warranted a dedicated response team felt ominous. Had there been accidents down here? Or worse? 4. If the clock reverses, hide and remain silent. I raised my eyebrows. The clock? What kind of malfunction would make time run backward? I couldn't make sense of it, and that alone made it unsettling. 5. No group of 3 or more is allowed outside designated work zones. That one was bureaucratic on the surface. A measure to prevent horseplay, maybe. Or perhaps the management didn't like too much chatter outside of controlled spaces. 6. Radios must remain on the assigned frequency at all times. That made operational sense, but written here with the rest, it suggested something more. Like deviation came with consequences. 7. One employee will be served a special meal each week. That employee is to finish it completely. This reads like tradition. A morale booster, maybe. Yet the phrasing put me off. Is to finish it completely. Not optional, not celebratory. It sounded like an obligation. I read over them again. The rules stood apart, disconnected at first glance, but collectively outlined a rigid framework for life on the rig. They seemed designed to enforce control, although the rationale behind each remained hidden. I wasn't sure if they were intended to protect us or to ensure our compliance. I stared ahead for a long time, letting the weight of the words sink in. Each line hinted at a context I had not yet encountered. They carried the chill of something prearranged and enforced with precision. These weren't mere guidelines. They read like terms of an agreement I had already entered into. I folded the paper and tucked it into my breast pocket. As I glanced out the narrow porthole, something quick and large flickered in the mist near the base of the rig. I dismissed it as a bird or a drifting shadow, unwilling to consider anything more. Behind me, the metal door shut with a mechanical sigh. The rig, it seemed, had swallowed me whole. That evening, after a lukewarm meal and a brief orientation video that said more in what it omitted than what it declared, I wandered the rig alone. The fading light painted the walkways in layers of copper and violet. I passed bulkheads, storage containers, coiled hosing, and workers whose faces seemed to blur in the shadows. Eventually, I found myself standing before a steel door, marked only by a keypad and a yellowed sign that had been scratched beyond recognition. Behind it, a stairwell led downward, disappearing into dimness that no bulb seemed able to penetrate. I did not open it. The thought crossed my mind, lingered there, but I pulled it back. I would be working down there eventually, and I wasn't about to set the wrong tone on my first day. Instead, I stood still, hand grazing the railing, aware of the cold draft whispering out from below, and let curiosity remain unanswered for now. By the time I returned to my quarters, night had deepened. The wind scraped along the walls like distant fingernails. Metal groaned in places it shouldn't. I stood at the center of the small room, feeling the strangeness of it all settle around me. My first hours on the rig had already gone in a direction I hadn't expected. There was something eerie in the air, true, but beneath it ran the thrill of finally working where I had always aimed to be. A place where my training, my experience, My time meant something, where the work mattered, where the stakes were real. I undressed, set my boots by the locker, folded my coveralls, and reached for the goggles. It felt strange to wear them indoors, even stranger at night, but I didn't hesitate for long. If that was the rule, I'd follow it. They wouldn't make it mandatory without reason. With a breath, I slid them over my eyes. The yellow tint dulled the edges of the room, softening the electric light into a murky sepia. I lay back on the cot, arms across my chest, the light vibration of the rig running through the mattress like a living pulse. It was already clear this job would be nothing like the work I'd done on land. The morning light on the rig was unlike anything I'd known on land. It had a way of spreading itself thin, filtering through salt-heavy air and the geometry of iron beams until it felt more like a suggestion than a presence. I opened my eyes to that watery glow, already aware of the low tremble under my cot. It was a reminder that I was not on Earth, not exactly, but on a suspended colossus, floating in industrial limbo. My goggles were still on. They'd pressed a shallow ridge into my forehead overnight, but I left them there. Part habit, part caution. The rules had a way of sticking, even the ones that didn't make sense. Outside, the corridor buzzed with the dull routine of machinery. I made my way to the mess hall, where the silence said more than any conversation could. The room was full, yet the air was thick with unsaid things. Conversations were quiet, and eyes were tired. I noticed how many wore their goggles like I did, even while eating. No one looked at each other for long. A man in an orange jumpsuit, older and weather-creased, nodded at me and handed me a clipboard. "You're with Reed today. Tool check in 15. Then he turned away without another word. His abruptness hit me harder than I expected. I'd worked in rough environments before, places where pleasantries weren't common, but this felt different. There was no sense of camaraderie, no trace of acknowledgement beyond the bare minimum. It was as if I'd walked into a prison instead of a job site, and the guards didn't bother pretending otherwise. Reed turned out to be tall and clean-shaven, with a lined face that looked like it hadn't smiled in years. We met near the central shaft where the rig's vertical core loomed like the spine of some long-buried animal. He skipped introductions and skipped the handshake. His eyes brushed over me, and he tilted his head toward the elevator that descended into the lower levels. I followed. The elevator whined as it dropped us down. Each floor we passed got darker, damper, and more distant from the rhythm of the upper decks. The metal walls here were lined with condensation. Pipes hissed, like breathing things. As we stepped out, the lights above flickered, casting brief shadows that stretched too long for comfort. I took it all in, how the air grew heavy, how sound muffled itself in corners, and asked, "What exactly goes on down here?" Reed didn't stop walking. "Stick to the inspection points, don't wander." "But what is this level for? It feels different. There's even a rule written just for this place." He turned, finally meeting my eyes behind our shared yellow tint. "Best not to ask questions about this part. Do your work, follow the checklist, and we'll get out clean." That was the first time I heard the phrase, "get out clean," used like that. It wasn't about oil or grease, it was something else. We moved through a narrow tunnel of steel, our boots echoing softly in tandem. The smell here had shifted, less diesel, more brine and metal. There were valves to check, pressure gauges to log, and seals to mark for maintenance. I noticed how Reed never let me walk behind him. He always positioned himself so I was either beside or slightly ahead, as if he didn't trust his back to anyone in this space. I started to understand why. Our checklist was nearly done by the time we looped back toward the junction where we'd started. I felt a slight easing in Reed's posture, and I assumed we were wrapping up for the day. We turned a corner into a wider hall where the overhead clock came into view. It was mounted high on a bulkhead, slightly dusted but unmistakably working. Or so I thought. As I lifted my pen to mark the final reading, the corridor lights faltered. First a dimming, then a violent stutter, like a heartbeat gone arrhythmic. I looked up instinctively. The second hand had slowed to a crawl, paused for a breathless moment, then resumed its motion in a slow, steady reversal. My breath caught. I remembered the list, the part about the clock. The rule had seemed absurd when I read it, a kind of scare tactic meant to keep new hires alert. But now, as I watched that second hand tick backwards, the warning felt carved into stone. My voice came out lower than I expected. "Is that supposed to happen?" Reed turned his head slowly, saw what I was seeing, and without a word, dropped into a crouch beside the nearest wall. He gestured sharply for me to do the same. I lowered myself. Heart pounding. The metal felt colder now. Reed pressed his fingers to his lips, the gesture universal. Silence. I heard something. A pulse. It felt as if an immense creature breathed beneath the surface, its exhale slow and deliberate, displacing water in a way that echoed through the steel floor. The rhythm wasn't steady. It surged in deep, irregular waves, like a body moving through the sea, brushing against the walls of its enclosure. Each vibration whispered of weight and purpose. I dared not speak. Something in my bones told me to remain absolutely still. The clock continued its slow, reversed ticking. In the silence, it became thunderous, a countdown to something I couldn't name. Reed kept his eyes down, goggles firm on his face. I mirrored him. The corridor stretched before us, shadowed and indifferent. Then, as abruptly as it started, the reversed ticking ceased. The second hand stopped again. The normal hum of electricity returned, and the lights steadied. Reed didn't move for another 30 seconds, then finally exhaled and stood up. "Why?" I started, but he cut me off with a glance. His calm, rehearsed control unsettled me. How could he act like this was normal? Like it was a scheduled drill rather than something unnatural twisting the core of this place? I stared at him, trying to understand how a man could witness that and respond with such clarity. "Don't speak about it. Just note the time on your log and move on." I scribbled down the numbers with a shaky hand. My thoughts raced with speculation, but I forced myself to file them away for later. The rig had its own logic, and it demanded obedience over curiosity. We moved forward, turning into a side hall lined with closed doors. My pulse still hadn't returned to normal after what we had just seen. The image of that clock rewinding, the strange pulse reverberating through the walls, it stayed with me like a shadow clinging to my back. I kept thinking about the rule. If the clock ticks in reverse, hide and stay silent. At the time, it felt like a superstition meant to unnerve us. But now I wasn't so sure. What kind of place writes rules for time moving backwards? Reed stopped abruptly. His entire frame tensed as if struck by a silent alarm. There was a taut readiness in his body that said this was not unfamiliar to him. He'd lived it before. He knew what came next. That unsettled me more than anything else could have. I followed his line of sight. On the metal floor just ahead, a dark pool of blood had settled in an unnatural stillness. It wasn't fresh, but it hadn't aged into obscurity either. The edges had begun to crust, a rusty brown outline enclosing a thick, almost congealed center. It looked like it had been waiting there for someone to notice. I stepped forward before I could stop myself, driven by the instinct to investigate, to help, maybe even just to understand. "Don't," Reed snapped, voice sharp as broken glass. "Not even close." I froze, mid-step. His tone was commanding in a way that revealed deep fear. That realization gripped my chest harder than the sight of blood ever could. He pulled the radio from his belt and clicked through frequencies until he hit the designated channel. "This is Deck C4. We have a red mark sighting. Send containment." Static crackled, followed by a brief affirmation. Reed tucked the radio away and gave me a look I couldn't interpret. A moment later, distant metallic footsteps echoed faintly through the corridor. The containment team was on its way. The sound grew louder with a rhythm that felt trained and familiar, not panicked. Whatever they were coming for, they had done it before. "Let's go," he said. "We finished the route. They'll handle that." I couldn't stop glancing back. I had seen blood on rigs before. Accidents were part of the job. Yet something about Reed's response unsettled me. The precision with which he changed the radio frequency, the speed of his call, and the unyielding order to stay away all pointed to a deeper concern. I found myself wondering whether it had really been blood. Could it have been a chemical leak mistaken for something else? Or was it somehow connected to the strange behavior of the clock earlier? The thoughts circled, refusing to settle. As we continued, I understood something in my gut. The rig had rules because failing to follow them could trigger consequences no one wanted to name aloud. Each directive seemed designed to preserve safety, a desperate attempt to contain something too dangerous to explain. The shift ended with Reed giving me a simple nod before disappearing toward the higher decks. Without a debrief or a single word of explanation, I stood at the stairwell, one foot on the bottom step, the other hesitant. I went back up slowly, goggles fogged at the edges, brain cluttered with questions I had no business asking. Someone needed to explain this. The rule sheet had hinted at danger, but no one had bothered to say what kind. I looked for a face, a gesture, anything that might crack the silence, but every technician I passed seemed locked in their own quiet routine. It was as if the entire facility had taken a vow of silence, their avoidance of conversation shaped by something more than habit, molded into policy. By the time I reached my quarters, the hallway lights had dimmed to a steady amber hue. I closed the door and leaned back against it, letting the cold press through my shirt into my spine. Inside, the silence pressed in from all sides. I sat on the cot, goggles still in place, and tried to steady my breathing. The day had left me shaken. The rules weren't suggestions. They were barriers, and something was pressing against them from the other side. I didn't know what. I only knew I had followed the instructions and still felt like I had come too close to something no one wanted to acknowledge. The rig demanded compliance, and today I understood why. I woke with the weight of the goggles pressing deep lines into my face, the plastic digging into the bridge of my nose, and the soft skin around my eyes. The habit of wearing them through the night had become more than routine. It had become a kind of tether, an unspoken pact with the silence that hovered over everything. But now they itched. They pressed too hard. The skin beneath them was tender, and I felt the discomfort crawling toward pain. I sat up slowly, letting my eyes adjust to the dim glow filtering through the slit-like window. The rig outside breathed its metal rhythm, steady and uncaring. I rubbed the marks on my face, then reached for the radio unit clipped to my belt. It was routine now to check it. I always checked the same frequency and channel. Still, something in me hesitated. I turned the dial just a touch. Static. Another notch. A hum. Then a voice. I turned the dial again. Two voices slipped through the static, low, deliberate, and unaware they were being heard. One of them spoke first, his tone composed but distant, like someone reading from a checklist. He has no one, no wife, no kids, no legal attachments. It's a clean choice. The second voice, slightly raspier and more casual, answered quickly. And he's quiet, keeps to himself, doesn't poke around. There was a long pause, the kind that thickens the air. Then came a brief chuckle, more like an exhale than laughter. He won't be missed. I leaned in, barely breathing. Something about the way they spoke felt rehearsed. They weren't debating, they were confirming. A final decision disguised as routine. The first voice returned, its edge sharpened. Then it settled, set the table. My pulse kicked. I didn't know who they were talking about, but the clinical tone of their discussion chilled me. A clean choice. Set the table. The phrasing felt rehearsed, euphemistic, and then I heard the word dinner. That's when the door slid open. A tall man in a blue utility jacket stepped in, his boots scuffing the threshold. He walked straight to me, plucked the radio from my hand, adjusted the dial back to the assigned frequency, and thrust it into my palm. Frequencies are locked for a reason. You change them again, and you're endangering everyone. Understood? I nodded, stunned. He left without another word. I sat there a moment longer, the radio still warm in my hand. The voices I had heard replayed in my mind, their cold precision, the way they chose someone, as if it were an inventory task. And now this. His urgency, the way he snatched the device, as if I'd stumbled onto something I had no right to witness. It wasn't just a security protocol. There was something they were trying very hard to keep buried. Whatever this plan was, whatever they were preparing for, it was important enough to shield with silence and sealed channels, and I had caught a sliver of it by accident. Moments later, another knock came. A crew coordinator stepped into the room, his tone all duty and no warmth. He didn't ask how I was, didn't look twice at my face or the mark the goggles had left, just handed me a folded assignment sheet like sliding a file under a prison cell door. "You're with Baker today. Reed's rerouted." I nodded again, slower this time. There was no room for questions, no chance to object. It felt less like taking a new post and more like being transferred under surveillance. The way orders were handed down, the way eyes lingered in the halls. This place operated more like a sentence than a workplace. And when I had joked before about it being a prison, I hadn't realized how close I was to the truth. Still, I couldn't stop thinking about Reed. He was the only one here who had spoken to me with any trace of normalcy, the only presence that made this place feel somewhat navigable. There was a quiet steadiness about him, not warm, but not cold either. He responded when I spoke, didn't turn away. And now, without a word, he was gone. It made me wonder if I had pushed too far with my questions the day before, if I had drawn the wrong kind of attention. Maybe his removal was meant as a warning. Maybe it was my fault. Outside, the platform groaned beneath a shifting tide, and the day began. The mess hall carried a heavier quiet than usual. Trays clattered against metal tables, boots echoed on the grated floor, and everyone kept their eyes on their plates. Conversations were nearly non-existent, drowned out by the metallic scrape of utensils and the low hum of overhead lights. Most were too focused on chewing, swallowing, and keeping their heads down to notice anything else. Then the overhead speaker clicked on, breaking the dull rhythm. A flat voice echoed through the room. "Special meal assignment. Baker. Section D double quote." No one clapped or nodded. Not a single reaction acknowledged the announcement. Heads lifted only for a moment, then dropped back to their meals. Baker himself barely reacted. He stood, walked to the counter and was handed a tray, unlike the others. Stainless steel with a covered dish, a small cup of something viscous and dark beside it. I watched him from 2 tables over, stunned into stillness. My mind reeled back to the voices I'd picked up that morning, the calm discussion about selecting someone with no family, no attachments, someone who wouldn't be missed. Baker's name hadn't been mentioned, but the coincidence gnawed at me. Out of everyone, he was the one chosen for this special meal. Was it really random? Or had I overheard the plan before it unfolded? My stomach tightened further as I realized I was now paired with him for the day. I didn't know what exactly had been decided over that hidden frequency, but the possibility that Baker was at the center of it made my skin crawl. I wondered, with a cold kind of fear, whether I'd be expected to watch something happen to him or help cover it up. Baker returned to his seat and ate in silence. His movements were mechanical. He chewed slowly, swallowed with effort. His hands trembled once, then steadied. I kept expecting him to stop, but he finished everything on the tray. When he was done, he simply stood and waited. After Baker finished his meal, he stood without speaking and made his way toward the door. I hesitated before rising to follow. My limbs felt heavy, as if that quiet meal had shifted the atmosphere around us. We left the mess in silence, walking side by side toward the southern sector where our assignment waited. The corridors felt longer than usual, stretched by the weight of what I had seen and heard. The maintenance zone loomed ahead, lit by flickering overheads that hummed just above hearing. Pipes lined the walls, sweating condensation that dropped like slow rain onto the metal grates below. The air was dense with salt and machinery. Our boots left dark, wet trails behind us. Baker hadn't spoken once since we'd left the mess. I glanced at him more than once, noting the stiffness in his shoulders, the vacant look in his eyes. Something in him had gone slack, like a wire pulled too tight had finally snapped. Trying to cut through the silence, I asked if he was feeling all right. "Just tired," he muttered. It was the kind of answer you give when you don't want follow-up questions. His voice was flat, missing the human flicker of mood or thought. I tried again, softer this time. "Have you ever talked to your family from out here?" He stopped walking for a beat, then turned to look at me. His eyes held me for longer than felt natural. Then, barely audible, he said, "Not in a while." We resumed walking. I kept pace beside him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was watching someone dissolving from the inside out. His steps lagged behind slightly. He forgot basic steps in our procedure, missed hand signals, and overlooked tools right in front of him. When he bent to pick up a pipe joint, his fingers swiped past it like he wasn't fully seeing it. Then, as he reached for a wrench, it slipped through his grip and crashed onto the floor. He didn't even flinch. I leaned closer, voice low. "They might have done something to your food. Are you sure you're all right?" He turned to me, his lips parted slightly as if trying to respond, but no words came. His gaze passed through me. It was like trying to talk to someone underwater, distorted and unreachable. His breath had become shallow. His eyes were glazed over. I said his name once, then again. And then he dropped. I caught him by reflex, arms wrapping around his torso to stop his head from hitting the grated floor. He was still breathing, but unresponsive, eyes open yet blank. The coldness of his skin startled me. My hands trembled as I reached for the radio clipped to my side. My thumb struggled to find the button, every second dragging beneath the weight of panic. "This is Section D, immediate medical. Crew member down." A crackle of static broke the silence, then a curt voice answered, devoid of emotion. "Acknowledged. Hold position." The line went dead. I crouched beside Baker, watching his chest rise and fall in shallow, uneven movements. His skin had taken on a pale sheen, and his eyes, though open, showed nothing. There was no recognition, no flicker of awareness. Footsteps thundered down the corridor. Two figures appeared from around the corner, clad head to toe in pristine white hazard suits. Their movements were synchronized, practiced, almost too smooth. They moved in silence, neither speaking nor asking questions. They lifted Baker between them, careful yet impersonal, and turned back the way they came. I pushed myself to my feet and stumbled after them. "Wait! Where are you taking him? What happened to him?" One of the figures paused just long enough to glance over their shoulder. The helmet obscured their face entirely. "Take a break. Return to quarters. That's your instruction." Then they continued without hesitation, their boots echoing against the metal floor until the sound disappeared into the rig's deeper corridors. I remained there, rooted to the spot, watching the empty hallway. 1,000 questions pressed against my skull, but none found a voice. I didn't know whether to follow or flee. All I knew was that something had just shifted, and whatever came next, I would face it alone. I returned to my quarters, but rest was impossible. My legs wouldn't stay still, and my thoughts refused to settle. The silence in the room felt tighter than usual, like the walls themselves were listening. Eventually, I stepped out, and began to wander the rig, drifting through corridors as if searching for something unnamed. The lights flickered overhead in irregular patterns, and every closed door hummed with quiet tension. My feet carried me closer to the lower levels. I wasn't even sure how far I had gone until I noticed the air thickening, the metal walls sweating with condensation. Then I saw him. At the far end of the corridor, barely lit by the emergency bulbs, stood Baker. I ducked behind a column instinctively, my heart pounding. He moved slowly, almost floating, his steps aimless and detached. His posture was unnatural, his head angled slightly as if listening to something deep beneath the platform. I checked my watch. It was late, far past curfew for non-critical zones. What was he doing here? Without hesitation, he approached the door that led to the bottom deck, the one marked off in the protocol. He pressed his hand against the panel and it slid open with a reluctant hiss. Then he stepped through. He didn't close it. Compelled by something between curiosity and dread, I followed. I crept along the edge of the metal walkway, keeping to the shadows. The lower deck opened into a vast chamber with exposed piping and vents that bled steam. I climbed a ladder that led to a service catwalk above, giving me a vantage point. From there, I watched him. Baker stood near the grated center of the platform where an open shaft descended directly into the sea. He swayed slightly, eyes unfocused. That's when I noticed he wasn't wearing his goggles, the one thing we were told to never remove, the one rule drilled into us from day one. My breath caught in my throat, and a sick realization crawled up my spine. The stillness shattered. A sudden low roar erupted from below, like something massive shifting through deep water. It vibrated through the steel under my feet and rattled the railings. The sound was thick, wet, and unmistakably organic. Not a machine, not an echo. It reminded me of a creature surfacing for air, exhaling as it moved beneath the platform. My whole body tensed as the noise faded, but the weight of it lingered in the air. I turned, and my gaze locked on the maintenance clock mounted above the exit hatch. It had stopped. Its hands began ticking backward. The rule, the one I had read, the warning. I dropped back down, heart hammering, and slipped through the lower corridor. I crouched behind a series of barrels, my view partially obscured, but enough to still see Baker. His body jerked forward once, then again, and then he vanished. Not with a scream, not with struggle. It was as if the sea reached up through the shaft and plucked him away. A quiet, horrifying pull. I stayed hidden, barely breathing, until the sound stopped and the air cleared. When I stepped back out, the door still hung open. My eyes darted back to the shaft one last time, unsure whether what I had just witnessed had truly happened. My heart hammered in my chest as I inched toward the exit, each step unsteady. The hands on the wall clock had begun to move normally again, ticking forward as if nothing had happened. I stood frozen for a moment, unable to process it all. It felt like I was walking out of a dream I couldn't fully wake from. Without looking back again, I made my way into the corridor, dazed and reeling, determined to return to my room. I needed to sit, to think, to breathe. A figure turned the corner just as I crossed the threshold. One of the supervisors. His face twisted into something like panic before hardening. "What are you doing here? You're not authorized to be down here. Baker, he went in there. Something took him. I saw it happen. He didn't struggle." The supervisor's eyes didn't flicker. His voice stayed level, colder than before. "That's enough. You saw nothing that concerns you." He didn't care. Not a trace of urgency, not a single word of concern, as if it hadn't mattered at all, as if Baker never existed. He grabbed my arm, tight. "Return to your quarters, now." He didn't let go until we had cleared the hall. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, shaking. It was no longer speculation, no longer distant. I had seen it. Something lived beneath this place, and it had taken Baker. The thought wouldn't leave me. The goggles were more than a uniform requirement. They served a purpose, a shield against something real. Every rule we were given carried weight, not as suggestions, but as barriers between us and something far worse. I wasn't safe, not even close. The events of the previous day had unsettled me to the core. I couldn't sleep without replaying every moment. Baker's distant eyes, the tremor in his hands, the way he collapsed without resistance. The look on his face showed no pain. Something inside had simply gone dark. The silence afterward was louder than any scream. This wasn't exhaustion or illness. This was something else, and no one seemed interested in explaining it. By morning, I felt a new kind of resolve. I needed to know what this place really was. Baker's disappearance couldn't be treated like an accident. There had to be documentation, incident reports, logs, anything. I didn't know what I expected to find, but the impulse to uncover something real, something I could hold on to, was stronger than my fear. There was a place I hadn't been allowed to enter, the archive level. I'd passed the door during earlier maintenance routes. It was sealed with a coated panel and bore a metal placard reading, "Restricted personnel only." That had to be it. When the corridor was clear, I made my way down the eastern arm of the rig. The door stood at the far end, unguarded but completely sealed. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what I would do if I actually made it inside. But the keypad was locked. I tapped it once, twice, hoping for a prompt or a hint. Nothing. There was no key card or biometric scan, only a blank denial. Disappointed but still desperate, I returned to my quarters. There had to be another way to listen in, to intercept what they were hiding. That's when I thought of the radio. I had heard them talk about the food and about Baker. If those voices had used a hidden frequency once, maybe others did too. Maybe the right frequency would unlock what doors could not. I sat down, clipped the unit from my belt, and turned the dial slowly. Static came in waves. Sometimes it sounded like breathing. I adjusted the tuner with small, careful movements, my ears strained for any sign of a voice. As I kept turning the dial, the radio suddenly froze on a single frequency. A strange, high-pitched tone began to emit from the speaker, thin and sharp, like a whistle inside a metal chamber. My hand instinctively pulled back, but the sound held, vibrating through the room. Then the space around me shifted. A low vibration rippled through the air as if pressure had dropped. The metal floor warmed beneath my boots. I couldn't make sense of it. Then a sound came through the walls, a deep, warbling moan, something massive stirring beneath the platform. I stood up instinctively. The sound grew louder and the radio in my hand vibrated slightly. Then I felt it, a presence. The lights flickered once. My breathing stopped. It came from the direction of the shaft. Heavy air, like water displaced by something moving through it. I pressed myself to the wall. A shape appeared through the far window. At first, it seemed like a figure, but as it drew closer, it became something else entirely. Its form pulsed and shifted, soaked and glistening as if it had just risen from the depths. Long, thin arms hung low, fingers webbed and twitching. Along its limbs, patches of glistening skin opened and closed like gills, releasing thin streams of water that trailed behind it. Rows of small circular suction marks lined the underside of its arms, and the sides of its neck expanded with each slow breath. It was as if a deep-sea creature had taken on a partial human frame, a grotesque fusion of form built for movement through dark waters. Its chest rose and fell with a slow, fluid rhythm. The closer it came, the more I saw the water still trickling from its shoulders and spine, pooling at its feet in a small puddle. It had heard something. It was searching. For a moment, I thought it saw me. Its head tilted slightly, revealing a single reflective eye, too large for its face. I froze in place. My goggles were still on. It hovered in place, twitching slightly. It didn't move toward me or strike. It simply stayed there, studying, and in that moment, I understood something vital. Those goggles were not ordinary safety gear. They were a layer of defense, a shield. They kept me invisible to it. Whatever that thing was, it couldn't see me through the lenses. That rule on the list, the one about never taking them off, made sense now in a terrifyingly real way. Then, the radio crackled again. Instantly, the creature turned, its head snapping toward the sound. It began to drift forward, moving with a slow, controlled precision that betrayed its size. It moved toward the device in my hand. I understood then that it had locked onto the radio. I took a slow, cautious step backward, then another, my eyes fixed on the creature's reflective gaze. It didn't lose focus. It began to follow, its dripping form gliding forward as if pulled by an invisible thread. I continued to back away, one measured step at a time, until the edge of the platform came into view. The sea below lapped softly against the rig's supports. I watched the creature's head tilt slightly, its attention unwavering. The high-pitched tone still buzzed from the device in my hand. I raised the radio slightly, then, with precise timing, hurled it into the dark water below. The moment the splash echoed, the presence moved. It turned with fluid, silent grace and disappeared beneath the waves. I stood there, breathless. The rule had made sense now. Keep the radios on the same frequency, not to stop leaks, to stop calls. I leaned against the wall, shaking. They weren't hiding accidents. They were hiding something alive, and they were keeping us just alive enough to keep the rig running, risking our lives daily for profit. That was the truth. We were expendable as long as the work continued. And now I had seen what lay beneath our feet. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Not yet. I wasn't sure I had the words, but I knew I couldn't carry this alone. I needed to find someone who had seen something, someone who had doubts like I did, someone who might have glimpsed what took Baker. As I replayed the scene in my head, a question settled deep inside me. Was that the same creature? The one that moved with wet, fluid grace, eyes reflecting unnatural light? Had I just witnessed the thing that dragged him down into the sea? So I started small. In the morning, I passed a worker in the supply corridor and asked him if he had ever seen anything strange near the lower decks. He didn't answer, just adjusted his grip on the crate and walked faster. Later, in the engine hall, I spotted two crewmen checking gauges. I approached casually, offered a nod, and asked about Baker. Their eyes narrowed slightly. One of them mumbled something about not being authorized to discuss assignments. Then they both turned their backs. I kept my distance, but followed the flow of movement. Tried again at lunch. No one made eye contact. I knew I had drawn attention to myself, but I needed answers. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, avoided deliberately. Still, a part of me clung to the thought that someone must know the truth. I had to keep looking. Then, late in the afternoon, I found myself in the central walkway alongside two other workers who had lingered after shift rotation. I asked them directly this time if they knew what the goggles were really for. Before they could even react, one of them stepped back and raised his hand. "Over here," he called. "We've got a breach." A voice barked from behind. 3 or more outside designated work zones is a breach. I turned to them in disbelief. "You really called them on me?" "I was just trying to talk," I said sharply, my voice low but laced with anger. Their expressions stayed blank. One avoided my eyes entirely. The other gave a subtle shrug, like it was nothing personal. 2 guards approached at a brisk pace. Their expressions didn't betray any emotion. They scanned our badges, confirmed our identities, and separated us without further explanation. "You've been warned," one said. I tried to protest, but they grabbed me by the arm and turned me down the side corridor. I didn't resist. There was no point. Within minutes, I was escorted to a small cell near the center shaft. 1 bed, 1 vent, a metal door. That was the moment I became certain that this place wasn't just operating like a prison. It truly was one. The lock clanked shut. There was no explanation or processing. Isolation. I sat on the edge of the bed, palms sweaty. This was no standard disciplinary action. It was complete containment. I'd asked the wrong questions. I'd stood too close. How could the thirst for profit justify risking every soul on this rig? How do you continue your day with something like that lurking beneath your feet? I'd reached toward something they wanted buried, and now they were showing me just how far they'd go to keep it that way. Time passed in a strange, windowless loop. I heard footsteps echo, doors creak, and water drip. But no one came, until a shadow passed between waking and dream, close and real. I saw it glide across the floor, stretching toward me. At first it was just motion, but then it came closer, deliberate steps, silent, unmistakable. Someone was outside. A figure moved into view, cloaked and slow, as if drawn forward by the dark. I sat up, tense. My eyes adjusted to the low light, and I saw the fabric of a hood, the glint of boots. And it was heading straight for my cell door. It was after lights out. The corridor outside was silent, save for the occasional knock of metal against metal. A figure appeared beyond the tiny glass slit, covered in a hood, face obscured. They knelt beside the door and leaned close. It wasn't a guard. It wasn't a creature. This was someone making a choice to be here, not someone sent. Whoever it was, they had come alone. "I saw you," he whispered. "At the archive room. I know what you're looking for." I stood up slowly, cautious. The figure remained crouched at the door, face hidden beneath the hood. My mind raced. Who was he? A worker like me? Someone with access? Or something else entirely? I searched for some detail, anything to anchor his presence to something real. Nothing came. "I can help you," he said. "I have access, but I need something in return." I stayed silent, unsure whether this was bait or a lifeline. Could I trust someone who approached in shadows and offered forbidden knowledge? Was this a trap set by the very people I was trying to expose? "You get the documents," he said, voice steady. "You take them off this rig. You tell people. Make them listen." My thoughts tumbled. If he was telling the truth, this could change everything. But if he wasn't, why? I finally asked. A long pause followed. Then came his answer. "Because I can't. But listen carefully. Tomorrow, after your shift, return to your quarters. Wait there. No matter what happens, they'll still assign you to work. That's your window." The moment hung in the air. Then he vanished from the slit of glass, his presence swallowed by silence. I heard his boots fade into the distance. The door stayed locked. I was left with a plan I hadn't expected, and a stranger I wasn't sure I could trust. But one thing was certain now. This had to be done. This prison, this hidden world under the guise of industry, needed to be known. Sleep never truly came to me that night. The metallic hum of the rig, the faint dripping sounds echoing from the pipes, and the replay of the creature's stare had all combined to create a sleepless fog in my mind. My limbs were heavy, and my thoughts scattered. As the morning light filtered in through the tiny grated vent, I was already awake, sitting upright, waiting. The door creaked open with a metallic groan, and a guard entered with a tray. He didn't say a word beyond what was necessary. "Eat! You're back on duty today." He handed me the tray, then placed a printed slip of paper on the metal desk beside the bed. My name was on it, followed by an alphanumeric location code. That was where I'd be stationed for the day. The moment he left, I forced myself to eat, barely tasting anything. I washed quickly, dressed, and fitted my goggles back over my eyes. As the lens locked into place, I couldn't help but remember the watery stare of that creature. These goggles had saved me once. They were the only shield I had. Work passed slowly. Every step I took, I felt the weight of eyes on me. Faces turned just slightly too late when I looked up. Conversations hushed. No one said anything directly, but it was obvious I had drawn unwanted attention. They all knew, or they had been told something about me. I kept my head down and finished my assigned task. The machinery I was checking made the same low groans as before, but everything now carried a sinister undertone. When the shift ended, I returned to my quarters in silence. I had no radio anymore. My only connection to this place had sunk into the ocean, and with it, any chance of listening in on hidden frequencies. I removed my gloves, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and leaned against the wall. Then, without warning, something slid under my door. A folded note. "Be ready. You'll hear a sound in 5 minutes." There was no signature, no further instruction, but I knew it was from him, the voice in the dark. I stared at the words until my heart began to race. 5 minutes. I checked the small analog clock on my wall and counted down silently. Just as the final seconds ticked by, a loud mechanical alarm began to sound. It wasn't the usual emergency drill or work shift siren. This one was distorted, irregular, and clearly unplanned. I opened the door and peeked out. People were running, shouting, clutching tools and helmets. Some guards barked orders. Lights flickered above. Smoke leaked from one of the side corridors. Then, from the left, a door creaked open and a hand shot out, grabbing my sleeve and pulling me inside with force. I stumbled, heart hammering, ready to fight whoever it was, but then I heard the voice. "You're late. We need to move." It was him, the hooded figure, the same voice from outside my cell. Still cloaked, still shadowed, but unmistakably calm in the chaos. He handed me a laminated card with an access chip embedded in it. "We're heading for the archive room," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Once we're in, I'll show you what they've been hiding. After that, make your way to the southwestern launch deck. Behind the crate lifts, there's a vertical storage shaft. Crawl space at the base, just enough to hide in. When the noise dies down and the alarms cut off, that's your moment. There should be a launch boat nearby. Take it. Get off this rig and don't look back." I wanted to ask questions. I wanted to know why he was helping me or who he really was, but he had already started moving. I followed. We passed through the lower corridors, weaving through maintenance routes that were temporarily unguarded thanks to the chaos he must have created. At last, we reached the archive level. The card beeped against the scanner and the door hissed open. Inside, rows of cabinets stretched along the walls. Dust-coated binders, labeled by year and sector, formed towering columns. He walked directly to one section marked Pelagos. He pulled out a thick, steel-bound folder and handed it to me. "Everything you need is in here," he said quietly, almost like a whisper meant only for me. His hand lingered for a moment, and in his voice I heard a kind of finality, as if this exchange marked the end of his purpose. "Keep it close. Don't stop for anything. Project Pelagos." The name alone made my stomach turn. We left in silence, the air between us tense and brittle. As we turned the corner, the metallic sheen of the corridor caught a streak of something dark and wet on the floor. I stepped closer and recognized it immediately, a deep, red smear, thick and clotted at the edges. Blood. It trailed along the floor in broken lines, vanishing under a doorframe. The rule came back to me like a whisper in my mind. Rule number 3. If you see blood, report it immediately. Do not touch it. My feet halted. The weight of the folder in my hands seemed heavier. The hooded man looked over his shoulder. Though most of his face was obscured, his expression remained unreadable. He didn't speak or offer any reassurance. He only gave a slight nod, the kind that implied urgency and expectation, as if telling me that this was the only option left. In that silent moment, I understood we had to keep moving. We stepped carefully around the stain. My chest tightened with guilt for not reporting it, but I knew we had no time. That stain served as more than a warning. It marked that whatever force maintained control over this place had already become aware that this place was already aware. And still, we moved forward. The hallway began to shift. Lights dimmed, and the pressure in the air grew dense and suffocating. From around the corner came the unmistakable, wet, dragging sound of something enormous moving with intent. My stomach knotted. I knew that sound. The memory of its form, the stench of seawater and decay, flooded back. This was not a new encounter. It was returning. The same creature I had seen before, the same presence that had haunted the dark edges of this place. My knees weakened and my breath quickened. I was terrified because I knew exactly what it was. I had seen it before. That memory was still vivid in my mind, and now it was happening again. The hooded man stopped, turned toward me, and pulled his goggles off slowly. "You need to run," he said. "Stick to the plan, do not turn back, no matter what happens." He raised both arms and began making loud, deliberate noise, banging against the metal railing beside us. I watched in disbelief as the creature responded, drawn directly to the sound. For a second, I thought he had lost his mind. Who would willingly summon that thing? But even through my fear, I couldn't ignore the steadiness in his actions. There was no hesitation, no sign of panic. As the creature rushed toward him, he didn't flinch. I was torn between horror and awe. He was giving me a chance, and I knew it. As terrified as I was, I found myself moving, driven by the silent demand of his sacrifice. Whatever madness he carried, it came with purpose. The man turned to me once more. "Go." I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the deck. Wind slammed into my face. The sea stretched into black nothingness. I ducked behind the crates near the lift and opened the Project Pelagos file. Pages fell into my lap, notes typed on thin old printer sheets, some of them water-stained, diagrams of the creature, maps of its known movement range, charts of sacrificial rituals encoded in corporate lingo, worker rosters, weekly candidate selection. The special meals were not celebrations, they were tools. The food was infused with suppressants to dull awareness, soften resolve, and make the chosen worker more compliant. Each week, someone vanished. The pattern wasn't random, it was calculated. Someone always disappeared after the meal. They were offered up. But this was never about the creature. Not entirely. It wasn't a cult or a sacred duty. This was about money. The rig's real mission was oil extraction. Massive profit. But deep below, where their drills pierced ancient trenches, they woke something. Something that would not allow them to continue unless it was fed. So they fed it. Sacrifices to protect the business. Human lives as payment of uninterrupted production. Every rule now revealed its true purpose. The goggles shielded you from the creature's gaze. The radios controlled the information flow. The rule about blood meant contamination, a sign of its proximity. The clock, when it ran backward, you had to hide. All of it was orchestrated, not to save lives, but to keep the operation alive. The rig was never meant to protect its workers. It was built to manage an ancient threat without slowing the flow of oil. My hands trembled as I clutched the documents. My breath hitched as the weight of their contents settled in my chest. These files were far beyond mere evidence. They had become my only lifeline. I folded them carefully and tucked them back into the folder, pressing it close to my chest. These pages had to reach land. The truth they carried could not die here. After what felt like an hour, the sirens fell silent. I crept from behind the crates, walked to the side rail, and located a secured emergency dinghy. The release system responded to the access card. I slid the boat into the water and climbed down the rope ladder with the folder strapped to my chest. The engine murmured beneath me as I kept the boat close to the rig's edge, threading my path through the shadows, navigating by the rhythm of swinging spotlights and the dark contours of the structure. The night air pressed in heavy and salty, thick with the tang of machinery and oil. Below, waves smacked against the hull in steady patterns, a lullaby that did nothing to calm the tension in my chest. Every foot I gained felt like a breath released. Distance meant safety, or at least the hope of it. The thought of the hooded man emerged again, unbidden. He had said escape wasn't an option for him. That admission clung to my mind like fog. Why? What had bound him here so permanently? What had he done or seen? The boat swayed with a sudden lift, a rolling swell shifting beneath the hull. I braced myself and scanned the dashboard. A small battered radio sat in the console's cradle. I reached for it, wiping seawater from the dial, and turned the knob slowly. Static cracked and whispered. I bypassed the rig's frequency, cautious not to alert anyone still monitoring. My fingers lingered over the dial. Then, slowly, I began to scan, frequency by frequency, praying to catch a sliver of life out there. Someone. Anyone. But then the water changed. The waves grew restless, their rhythm shattered, dissolving into a chaotic churn. My skin prickled as a low vibration crawled up through the floor of the boat. I turned my head slowly, heart thudding, and saw the sea swell in an unnatural shape. The sight was terrifying, but it wasn't unfamiliar. I had heard this rhythm before, had felt this pressure against my ribs. It was the same pulse I had known on the rig. This fear wasn't new. It was the echo of that creature's return, and this time, I was alone. Before a coherent thought could form, a massive force struck the side of the boat. A sudden impact had slammed into the side of the boat with brute force, unlike anything nature could explain. The vessel heaved sideways, pitching me into the air. My temple cracked against the metal edge as I was flung into the sea. A scream erupted from my lungs but was immediately silenced by the ocean's cold grasp. Water enveloped me, crushing and all-consuming. The folder was ripped from my arms. I reached for it, but it vanished in the darkness below. The surface above rippled like a distant dream, slipping farther away as I sank into blackness. The last thing I felt was the cold, crushing weight of the sea pressing in from all sides. I gasped for air, but my lungs filled with salt and panic. Then everything vanished. My vision collapsed inward, and I sank into unconsciousness. Darkness. Then light. A glare stung my eyes as I blinked against it. Hands gripped my arms, dragging me across wet wood. Voices shouted over the hum of an engine and the slosh of waves. Coughs racked my chest as I heaved out seawater, gasping for air like it was the first breath of my life. I coughed up water and blinked against the sun. I was lying on a wooden deck, surrounded by men in heavy raincoats. "You all right, son?" A rough voice. Calloused hands. They were fishermen. They had found me floating near the shoals. I bolted upright, panic flooding me. "The folder," I said. "The papers." They exchanged confused glances. "We didn't see anything else," one said. "Just you, barely breathing." I collapsed back onto the deck, drenched and broken, salt water clinging to my skin like a second layer. The silence around me roared louder than the sea had. My arms felt hollow, my chest caved in. The folder, my only proof, my only hope, was gone. I had clung to those papers like a lifeline, believing they would change something, expose the horror, save someone. Now they were just ink dissolving into the ocean. Everything I had seen, everything I had endured and sacrificed to uncover, vanished beneath the waves. A sense of failure wrapped around me, tighter than the wet clothes on my back. I had nothing left but memory and the ache of knowing that truth had sunk before it could breathe. Weeks passed. I shared everything I had witnessed, from the rituals to the creature to the desperate escape. Each word felt heavier than the last, but my voice faltered under the weight of disbelief that met me. Without documents, without names or tangible proof, my story sounded like the ramblings of a man broken by the sea. The company issued an official statement. According to them, I had simply fallen overboard during routine maintenance. The rig had no record of anything unusual. My truth had been silenced beneath the official line. Then, one morning, while sipping coffee in a diner near the docks, I saw the headline on a small newspaper. "Rig worker Reed Smith found dead under mysterious circumstances. Family demands answers." I stared at the photo, numbness settling over me like a heavy tide. It was him. The hooded man who had led me through the shadows, who had risked everything to hand me the truth. Reed had guided me, protected me, And when it mattered most, he had given himself up so I could run. And now, he had been erased. His name reduced to a few lines in a local paper, his sacrifice swallowed by the same system he tried to fight. All we had done, all we had uncovered, everything we had lost, it had meant nothing. The rig was still running. The company still denying. The creature still lurking beneath the waves, fed by new workers unaware of the rules or their meaning. Every death, every page of evidence, every moment of horror, wasted. I folded the paper slowly, my hands trembling. My heart was heavier than it had ever been. Some truths weren't meant to be told. Some horrors sink into the sea and never rise again. The marsh runner was worse than I expected. I'd seen the photos, grainy, sun-faded pictures my uncle had mailed to me years ago. But standing on the warped dock of Gator's Bend, staring at the 22-foot flat-bottomed fishing boat, I realized those images had been charitable. The hull was a patchwork of repairs, patches over patches. The console was salt-crusted and faded to a dull gray. The canopy had more holes than fabric. The brass fittings were green with verdigris, but it floated and it had an engine, and according to the will my lawyer had read over the phone, it was now mine. So was the cabin. So was the business. So were the problems. "Come on, Jake," I called, my voice hollow in the humid air. My blue heeler picked his way down the dock behind me, his nails clicking against the weathered planks. He was 6 years old, loyal to a fault, and the only friend I had left after the software startup imploded and took my reputation with it. Jake had been with me through the apartment in Austin, the failed gig in Houston, the awkward months crashing on my sister's couch in Dallas. He'd been with me when I'd gotten the call about Uncle Elias, when my sister had asked if I wanted to fly out for the funeral, and I'd realized I didn't even know what he looked like anymore. Jake wasn't happy about being here. His ears were pinned back, and his usual bounce was gone. Every few steps, he'd pause and sniff the air, catching something I couldn't. The Everglades had a smell, thick, organic, faintly rotten, that hung over everything in Gator's Bend. It was the smell of water that barely moved, of mangroves that had been dying and regenerating for millennia, of things decomposing in the heat. Jake clearly hated it. "I know, buddy," I said, scratching behind his ears. "Not exactly the beach." I shouldered my duffel bag and climbed aboard the marsh runner. The deck flexed under my weight, and I made a mental note to have someone inspect the hull. The cabin was cramped. A head, a tiny galley, a narrow bunk. Everything was cramped. My uncle had apparently believed in minimalism by necessity or preference. Maybe both. But it was the console that caught my attention. Nailed to the wooden surface, slightly weathered but carefully preserved under a sheet of clear plastic, was a piece of waterproof parchment. Handwritten on it, in careful, deliberate script, was a list. The ink had faded but remained legible. I could tell immediately that whoever had written this had done so with intention. I had to read it twice. The 10 rules for the marsh runner. 1. Before the engine turns over, ring the brass ship's bell 3 times. It's a greeting, an announcement of your presence. A silent start is an intrusion. 2. The first fish of the day is a tithe. You must release it back to the water, unharmed. It is not yours to keep. 3. No loud music, no shouting. Speak in hushed tones. The gloom is drawn to cacophony. 4. The fishing grounds are clearly marked on the old chart. The sectors shaded in gray, the Whispering Mangroves, Sorrow Creek, and the Still Water, are never to be entered. The fishing there is not worth the price. 5. Never stare into the deep, still black water for more than a moment. If you see a face that isn't your own, look away immediately and ring the bell once. 6. If you snag your line on something and cannot free it, cut the line. Do not reach into the water to retrieve it. What's down there isn't always wood. 7. On the new moon, leave a personal item of value on the flat, moss-covered stone at the mouth of Sorrow Creek. It is a toll for safe passage through its territory for the coming month. 8. Never call out to another boat by the captain's name. Use the boat's name only. Names are beacons. 9. You must always leave the fishing grounds before the last sliver of sun disappears below the horizon. The gloom becomes bold in absolute darkness. 10. Your dog, a loyal blue heeler, senses the gloom before you do. If he whines, hides under the console, or refuses to get on the boat, the trip is canceled. No exceptions. His life depends on it, and so does yours. I read through them again, feeling the beginnings of a headache. The gloom. Okay, sure. Uncle Elias had spent 40 years living alone in a swamp and had apparently lost his mind. My uncle had always been odd, the family eccentric, the one who'd chosen isolation over ambition. He'd inherited this charter business from his father, who'd inherited it from his father. 4 generations of Caruths running fishing tours through the Everglades. My grandfather had expanded it into a real business, with promotional materials and partnerships. My uncle had let it shrivel into a ghost operation that barely paid his property taxes. I'd assumed it was because he was lazy or damaged or both. Now I was starting to understand that it was because he was scared. These weren't the rules of a businessman. These were the rules of someone trying to appease something. Someone who'd learned those rules the hard way, maybe. Someone who'd paid a price for breaking them. The specificity of them. The ritualistic nature. It all suggested that Uncle Elias hadn't written them down as a joke or a quirk. He'd written them down as a warning. Jake jumped into the cabin with me and immediately crawled under the narrow bunk, pressing himself against the hull as if he could make himself invisible. I'd seen him anxious before, but this was different. His entire body was trembling. "Hey," I said softly, crouching down. "It's okay. We're just staying here tonight." Jake didn't come out. He just watched me with dark, worried eyes. I stood up, rubbing the back of my neck. The cabin felt smaller than it had moments before. I could hear the sound of the swamp through the open window. Insects, mostly. A constant chirring that was almost like static. Underneath it, occasionally, the distant bellow of an alligator. The humidity was oppressive, making my shirt stick to my skin. Even the small cabin felt like it was suffocating me with wet air. I needed to get out, get my bearings, figure out what I actually had here. The town of Gators Bend consisted of exactly 3 businesses: a general store, a boat repair shop, and a motel that looked like it hadn't been remodeled since 1987. The population was maybe 500 people, mostly old folks who'd retired here, or families who'd never left. The roads were all gravel. The humidity was suffocating. I could see the swamp from almost everywhere. Vast, flat, impenetrable water with cypress trees and mangroves. The landscape stretching out in every direction like some primordial nightmare. Nothing about this place felt welcoming. I'd spent the last 6 months in Austin, in a glass office building, staring at code. This was about as far from that as possible. This was exile. This was surrender. The general store was the only place that looked inhabited. I pushed through the screen door, leaving Jake on the porch. He didn't want to come inside anyway. The owner was a woman in her 70s, with iron gray hair and the kind of weathered tan that comes from a lifetime in the sun. Her name tag said, Margie. "You're Elias's nephew," she said. It wasn't a question. "News travels fast," I said. "News doesn't travel at all in Gators Bend. Margie just knows things." She smiled, and it was sad. "I'm sorry about your uncle. He was a good man. I didn't really know him, I admitted. We saw each other maybe 5 times after I was 12. Margie nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd suspected. He kept to himself, but he was good about what he did, understood the balance. Balance? I asked, picking up a bottle of water from the cooler. The Glades give and the Glades take, Margie said. That's what Elias used to say. Your uncle knew what to give. I paid for the water and left the store, my skin prickling with irritation. Everyone in this town seemed to be speaking in riddles. Uncle Elias's rules, Margie's cryptic warnings, Jake's visible terror. It all felt like something from a bad horror film, the kind where the protagonist ignores every warning and walks straight into disaster. That wasn't going to be me. I was practical, rational. I'd spent my entire adult life solving problems with logic, not superstition. Over the next week, I settled into the cabin and started learning the business. There were files, old chartering records, customer information, booking details. My uncle had apparently been running about 3 charters per month, which was pathetically low. The rates were laughably outdated. The boat needed serious work. But there was money, $50,000 in a checking account that my uncle had been saving over decades. Not much, but enough to live on while I figured things out. I also figured out the rules. Or rather, I decided which ones I could ignore. My first charter was with an older man named Raymond who wanted to fish for redfish. He came alone, which I appreciated. I took him to the standard spots, the areas marked on the chart with green checks. Before I started the engine, I reached up and grasped the brass bell. It was surprisingly cold under my fingers. 3 rings, like the rule said. It felt ridiculous, like I was playing make-believe in my uncle's paranoia. Raymond didn't comment on it. He just settled into his seat and waited. We reached the fishing grounds and it was decent. Raymond caught his first fish within the hour, a decent-sized redfish. I watched as he began to reel it in. Then I realized the tithe. Rule number 2, I had to release it back to the water unharmed. The first fish of the day wasn't his to keep. That's not going in the cooler? Raymond asked, noticing my hesitation. It's tradition, I said finally. I carefully netted the fish and released it back into the water. First one always goes back. Raymond seemed to accept this. We fished for another 6 hours and he caught 4 more. He seemed happy with that, seemed to respect the tradition. He paid me in cash and thanked me on his way out. Your uncle was a good guide, Raymond said as he was leaving. Fair man. Knew how to treat the water. The second charter was a couple from Miami on their anniversary. I started the engine and rang the bell 3 times. It felt less ridiculous now, almost reflexive. We fished in the green zones. The wife caught the first fish, a small bass. I released it. She didn't protest. They seemed to understand, or at least accept, that this was how things were done. They had a good day, caught plenty of fish that they did keep, seemed happy. The third charter was a solo angler looking for trophy bass. I rang the bell 3 times. The routine was settling into me. He caught the first fish, a decent catch. I released it. By now, I wasn't even thinking about how strange it was. It was just what we did. But as the days stretched into the second week, something shifted in me. The bell started to feel like a performance. The tithe started to feel like a waste. 3 weeks in, and I was beginning to feel almost competent. The business wasn't exciting, but it was stable. I could see the potential to modernize it. Better marketing, updated pricing, maybe even a website. I could turn this into something profitable, something real. That's when Jake changed. It was a Sunday morning, cool and gray before the heat of the day. I was preparing for a charter with a group of 4 fishing enthusiasts from Tampa. They'd booked through an online listing I'd posted, and they'd specifically requested an authentic experience at a good price. I'd given them a deal, eager for the positive reviews. The money was good, $400 for a full-day charter. It could help pay for engine repairs. Jake refused to get on the boat. "Come on, buddy," I said, holding open the cabin door. "It's just a day trip." He planted himself on the dock, his entire body rigid. His eyes were fixed on the water, and his whine was low and constant, a sound I'd never heard from him before. It was a sound of pure, primal dread. It was the sound of an animal recognizing danger that human senses couldn't perceive. "Jake, we talked about this. It's fine. Come on." He didn't move. I stood there for a moment, looking at my dog, and then at the 4 men in the boat waiting for me to cast off. The morning was wasting. They'd lose fishing time. I thought about rule number 10, the last rule on the list, the one that specifically mentioned a blue heeler. No exceptions. His life depends on it, and so does yours. Then I thought about the money. $400 for a full-day charter. More positive reviews, building my reputation, getting the engine fixed. "It's okay," I told Jake firmly. "We're just going to the usual spots." "Nothing's going to happen." I left him on the dock, in the cabin, with water and food. I didn't look back as I started the engine. I didn't ring the bell 3 times that morning. I just turned the key, felt the engine rumble to life, and steered the marsh runner out into the water. The marsh runner cut through the water toward the fishing grounds, the morning sun reflecting off the sawgrass. The tourists were chatty, excited, eager. I found myself relaxing. Jake's anxiety had been getting to me over the past few weeks, constantly on edge, his unease bleeding into everything. Out here, on the water, everything felt normal. We reached the green zone, and the fishing was good. One of the men hooked something large early on, and they all gathered around, cheering quietly as he played the line. Their excitement was contagious. As the day wore on, I found myself thinking about those gray zones on the map, about the sectors my uncle had marked as forbidden. The fishing here was good, but I could see deeper water to the north and east, where the mangroves grew thicker, where the water was darker and seemed to hold something beneath its surface. The still water, the chart called it. No loud music, no shouting. Speak in hushed tones. The gloom is drawn to cacophony. "Hey, Captain," one of the men called, approaching the console where I was standing. He was already several beers into the day. They'd brought a cooler stocked with them. "You know what would make this day perfect? Some music. You got any good fishing playlist? Something to keep the energy up?" I looked at him. I looked at the men in the boat, their faces flushed with sun and excitement and alcohol. I looked at the chart, at those gray sectors marking forbidden water. I looked at the deeper water beyond the green zone, where the fishing would be even better. I thought about modernizing the business. I thought about money. I thought about Jake, trembling on the dock 3 hours ago. And I made a choice. "Yeah," I said slowly. "I think I might have something." I reached for the small Bluetooth speaker I'd been considering bringing on charters. It was a violation of rule number 3. It was a test. "Let me see what we've got," I added, my hand hovering over the speaker, already feeling the weight of the decision. This was the moment. The rules were just an old man's superstition, weren't they? Just the paranoia of someone who'd been alone too long in the swamp. I was about to find out if I was right, or if I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life. I turned on the Bluetooth speaker. The first few notes of some classic rock song, I didn't even know which one, drifted across the water, and the men from Tampa immediately cheered. One of them cracked another beer. Another started singing along, badly, his voice echoing across the still morning air. The green zone, the safe fishing grounds my uncle had marked decades ago, suddenly felt less sacred and more like exactly what it was, a swamp with some decent bass in it. Nothing happened, no fog rolled in, no ghostly presence manifested. The Everglades just kept being the Everglades, hot, humid, alive with insects and the occasional heron flying overhead. The music played, the men laughed, they fished. Rule number 3, broken, and the world kept turning. "See?" one of them called over to me, a guy named Derek who'd mentioned he was the groom-to-be. "This is way better, man. You had us all whispering like we were in a library or something." I forced a smile. My hands were still tight on the wheel, my heart still racing from the decision I'd just made. but as the minutes ticked by and nothing supernatural occurred, I felt my anxiety begin to morph into something else. Vindication, relief, and underneath it all, a creeping sense of superiority. My uncle had been paranoid. The rules were nonsense. This was just a swamp. The fishing in the green zone was good that morning. The men were hauling in largemouth bass at a steady clip, whooping and hollering with each catch. But by mid-morning, as the sun climbed higher and the heat became oppressive, their enthusiasm started to wane. "Hey, Captain," Derek called, approaching the console where I stood. He was sunburned, half-drunk, and wearing a shirt that said, "Last Sail Before the Veil." His 3 friends, groomsmen presumably, were similarly disheveled. "This is fun and all, but we were hoping for something more. I don't know, authentic. We're paying good money here." "This is authentic Everglades fishing," I said, keeping my voice even. "Yeah, but like..." Derek gestured vaguely at the water around us. "Can't we go somewhere wilder? Somewhere the fish are bigger? I mean, we came all the way down from Tampa for a bachelor party. We want stories, you know? Something we can't get from some tour boat full of retirees." One of his friends, a stocky guy with a buzz cut whose name I'd already forgotten, chimed in. "We saw this documentary once. They went into these like deep mangrove tunnels, super remote. The fish were monsters. That's what we want." I should have said no. I should have explained that the green zones were marked green for a reason, that my uncle, who'd spent 40 years navigating these waters, had deliberately avoided certain sectors. I should have told them about the rules. Instead, I thought about money. $400 was good. But Derek leaned in closer, his breath reeking of beer, and said, "We'll pay you triple if you take us somewhere off the beaten path. $1,200, cash, right now. We just want one epic story to take back. $1,200. That was 3 weeks' worth of charters at my current rate. That was the engine repair I needed. That was the new canopy, the fresh paint, the updated electronics. That was proof that I could make this business work, that I hadn't failed again." I looked at the chart mounted beside the console. The green zones where I'd been taking clients were clearly marked with check marks. But to the north and east, there were 3 sectors shaded in gray, marked with my uncle's careful handwriting: Whispering Mangroves, Sorrow Creek, and the Stillwater. Rule number 4 echoed in my mind. The fishing grounds are clearly marked on the old chart. The sectors shaded in gray are never to be entered. The fishing there is not worth the price. But I'd already broken rule number 3. Nothing had happened. And rule number 10, Jake's refusal to board, should have canceled this trip. But Jake was back at the cabin, probably sleeping, and I was out here, fine, with paying customers who wanted an adventure. Maybe my uncle had been overly cautious. Maybe the gray sectors were just dangerous from a navigation standpoint. Submerged logs, shallow water, easy places to ground a boat. That would make sense. That would be rational. "The Stillwater," I said slowly, pointing to the darkest of the gray sectors. "If we go there, the fishing will be better. But you need to understand, it's remote. There's no cell service. If something goes wrong, we're on our own." Derek grinned. "Perfect. That's exactly what we want." I hesitated for one more moment, my finger tracing the boundary line on the chart. The Stillwater was perhaps 3 miles northeast of our current position. The chart showed it as a sector of deep, dark water surrounded by dense mangrove forests. My uncle had written a single word next to it, N.O. But that was just paranoia. That was just an old man's fear. I turned the wheel and pointed the marsh runner northeast. The change was gradual at first. The sawgrass passages gave way to narrower channels, the water deepening from the tea-brown of the shallows to an opaque black. The cypress trees grew denser, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that hung like curtains. The sunlight, which had been harsh and direct in the green zone, became diffused and gray as we moved deeper into the canopy. The music was still playing, some upbeat country song now, but it felt wrong here. The sound seemed to get swallowed by the landscape, as if the swamp itself was absorbing it. "This is more like it," one of the groomsmen said, but his voice lacked conviction. Even drunk and sun-addled, they could feel the shift. I could too. The temperature had dropped, maybe 5 or 10 degrees. The air smelled different, not just the organic decay that permeated the entire Everglades, but something else. Something mineral and cold, like the inside of a cave. My skin prickled with goosebumps despite the humidity. I thought about Jake refusing to board this morning. His whine, that low primal sound of warning. I thought about turning back, but then I saw the water ahead, opening into a wide, still expanse. The still water. It was perfectly named. The surface was like black glass, reflecting the gray sky and the twisted shapes of the mangroves that ringed it. There was no current here, no ripples, nothing to suggest movement of any kind. "Holy shit," Derek breathed. "This is incredible." I cut the engine, letting the marsh runner drift into the stillness. The music was still playing, but it sounded tinny and small now, a pathetic human noise against the vast, ancient silence of this place. "Can we fish here?" one of the groomsmen asked. "Yeah," I said, my voice hoarse. "Yeah, go ahead." They baited their lines and cast. Within seconds, the first one got a hit. The rod bent nearly double, the reel screaming. The guy yelped in excitement and his friends crowded around him. I watched as he fought the fish as it thrashed and dove in the black water. When he finally hauled it up, it was a largemouth bass that must have weighed 8 or 9 pounds, easily the biggest catch of the day. Its scales were dark, almost black, and its eyes seemed strangely clouded. "This is insane," Derek shouted, already casting his own line. "The fish here are huge." And they were. Within 10 minutes, all 4 men had hooked trophy-sized bass. Their initial unease evaporated in the face of success. They were laughing again, shouting, playing their music louder. Someone turned it up, and the bass pounded across the water. I should have stopped them. I should have remembered rule number 3. No loud music, no shouting. Speak in hushed tones. The gloom is drawn to cacophony. But I didn't, because part of me, the part that was vindicated, the part that had been right to ignore Jake, right to ignore the rules, wanted to see what would happen, wanted proof that my uncle had been wrong, that I was smarter, more modern, more rational. And another part of me, deeper and darker, simply didn't care anymore. I'd already made the choice. I'd already crossed the line. The men fished for another 20 minutes, their voices growing louder, their celebration more raucous. They'd caught a dozen massive bass between them. One of them suggested jumping in for a swim to cool off. I told him no, told him the water wasn't safe, but my words lacked authority. I'd brought them here, I'd let them break every rule. That's when the fog came. It didn't roll in like normal fog. It didn't drift or creep. It simply appeared, materializing on the far side of the still water, like something emerging from behind a curtain. It was thick and low to the water, and its color was wrong. Not white or gray, but a sickly, bruised purple, like old meat. "What the hell is that?" one of the groomsmen said, his voice suddenly small. The fog began to move toward us, faster than any natural fog should move. It crossed the water in seconds, swallowing the mangroves on the far shore, consuming the reflected sky, erasing everything behind it. The music was still playing. The men were still standing there, rods in hand, frozen in place. I reached out and shut off the speaker, my hands shaking. The sudden silence was deafening, but it was too late. The fog reached the boat, and the temperature plummeted. I could see my breath. The men could too. Derek's face had gone pale, his earlier bravado completely gone. "Captain," he said quietly, "I think we should go." I started the engine, or tried to. I turned the key, and nothing happened. No rumble, no cough, not even a click. The marsh runner was dead in the water. "Come on," I whispered, turning the key again and again. "Come on, come on, come on." Nothing. The fog surrounded us now, so thick I could barely see the bow of the boat. The black water beneath us was perfectly still, and in the silence, I heard it. A sound. Not quite a voice, not quite a whisper. It was like static, like white noise, but underneath it there were patterns, words maybe, or the memory of words, spoken in a language that had never been human. One of the groomsmen started to laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. It was high-pitched, nervous, bordering on hysterical. "Shut up," Derek hissed. "Just shut up." But the laughter continued, and then I saw it, movement in the fog. Not shapes, exactly, but suggestions of shapes. Tall, thin things that might have been trees or might have been something else. They surrounded the boat, just beyond the edge of visibility, and they were watching us. I tried the engine again. Still nothing. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might break through my chest. This was real. This wasn't paranoia or superstition or an old man's fear. This was real, and I had brought these men into it, and I had no idea how to get them out. "Leo," Derek said, his voice shaking. "What is this?" I didn't have an answer, because the truth, that I'd ignored every warning, broken every rule, led them into a place my family had spent generations protecting people from, would sound insane. But as the fog pressed closer, and the temperature dropped further, and those shapes in the mist grew more solid, more present, I realized that insanity might be the least of our problems. The gloom had found us, and it was hungry. The fog didn't feel like fog. It felt like pressure, a weight pressing down on the boat, on my chest, on my mind. The temperature had dropped so far that our breath came out in visible clouds, and the black water beneath us had begun to move, though there was no wind. Small ripples spread outward from nothing, as if something vast was stirring in the depths below. I thought of Jake, of his refusal to board this morning, of his low primal whine, the sound of an animal recognizing danger that human senses couldn't perceive. I had left him on the dock with water and food, had told him it was fine, that nothing would happen. But even then, I had known I was lying. Some part of me, buried deep underneath the greed and the vindication and the desperate need to prove myself, had known exactly what I was doing. Derek's face was completely drained of color now. His sunburned skin had turned a sickly gray. "What is happening?" he whispered. His voice shook. "Leo, what is this?" I didn't answer. I couldn't, because I was beginning to understand that everything my uncle had warned me about was real. Every rule, every cryptic warning from Margie at the general store, every careful notation on that waterproof parchment nailed to my console, and I had walked 4 innocent men directly into its mouth. The gloom wasn't attacking. It was waiting, watching. The fog seemed to have a texture to it now, almost viscous, as if it had become a physical thing rather than mere atmospheric vapor. I could feel it brushing against my skin, cold and slightly oily, leaving behind the faint scent of something mineral and ancient. And beneath the oppressive silence, I could hear that sound again, that static-like whisper that wasn't quite a voice. It was underneath my skin now, vibrating in my bones. I realized I could almost understand it, almost grasp the meaning of those not quite words, but understanding felt dangerous. Understanding felt like surrender. One of the groomsmen, the stocky guy with the buzz cut whose name I'd forgotten almost immediately, started to laugh. It was a small, uncertain sound at first, almost like a nervous hiccup, but it built, grew louder, more uncontrolled. His entire body seemed to be vibrating with it. His friends stared at him, their faces shifting from confusion to concern. "Hey man, you okay?" another one asked, reaching out to touch his shoulder. The gesture was gentle, worried, the gesture of someone who still believed his friend might snap out of whatever this was. The laughing man didn't respond. His eyes were still fixed on the water, but they weren't seeing anything anymore. They were the eyes of someone looking inward, watching something in his own mind that no one else could perceive, something vast and terrible and utterly fascinating. The laughter continued, high-pitched now, almost childlike, the sound of someone discovering a joke so hilarious it transcended all other reality. But his face was blank, vacant, like his body was just a puppet and something else was operating it from within. I watched as something changed in him. It was subtle at first, just a slight slackening of his jaw. Then his shoulders relaxed. The tension that had held him upright seemed to drain away like water from a broken vessel. The laughter died mid-sound, cut off like someone had flipped a switch. His hands dropped to his sides. He just stood there, swaying slightly, his breathing shallow and mechanical, like a machine that had just been switched to standby mode. "Dude?" Derek stepped toward him, concern crossing his sunburned face. His earlier bravado completely evaporated. "You're freaking us out, man." The man didn't acknowledge him, didn't acknowledge anything. He didn't even seem to see Derek, though Derek was standing right in front of him. He just turned, slowly, deliberately, like a machine, and looked down at his hands. He turned them over, studying them as if he'd never seen hands before, as if they belonged to someone else, as if they were fascinating, alien objects that had somehow attached themselves to his wrists. His fingers moved slowly, testing each joint, watching them bend and straighten with apparent wonder. I realized I was holding my breath. Then he smiled. Not a real smile. Not the smile of someone experiencing joy. A smile that came from somewhere deep and empty. A smile that had been programmed into his face by something that didn't fully understand human expressions. And he walked to the railing of the boat. Just walked. Steady. Purposeful. Like he'd been walking toward that railing his entire life. "Hey, hey, hey!" Derek grabbed his arm. His voice had risen, panic bleeding through. "What are you doing?" "Get away from there." For a moment I thought Derek would be able to stop him. I thought maybe the man would snap out of it, whatever it was. Maybe Derek's grip would anchor him to humanity. Maybe his friend's fear would reach through whatever void had opened up inside his mind. But the man just looked at Derek with those blank, empty eyes. There was no recognition there, no memory of friendship or shared beers or laughter about stupid things, no trace of whoever he'd been. He turned back to the water and stepped over the railing. He stepped into the black water as if he was stepping into an elevator, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. He didn't struggle, didn't gasp at the cold that should have shocked his system. He didn't flail or panic or call out for help. He just stood there in the water, waist deep, then chest deep, staring at nothing. His mouth moved slightly, like he was trying to remember how to speak, but no sounds came out, just empty movements of lips that had forgotten their purpose. "Oh God," Derek breathed. "Oh God, what the hell?" The second groomsman started to laugh. This one was different. His laughter was lower, more primal. It came from deep in his chest and sounded almost like barking. He was standing near the back of the boat, his fishing rod forgotten on the deck beside him. The fog seemed thicker around him, the purple bruised color deepening to almost black. As I watched, I realized the fog wasn't moving around him. It was moving through him, wrapping around him like living smoke, like it was embracing him, like it was intimate. I found myself on my feet, though I didn't remember standing. "Stop," I heard myself say. My voice sounded very far away. "Stop laughing. Please stop." He didn't stop. He kept laughing, and I could see his eyes starting to change. They were going glassy, unfocused, like he was looking through me instead of at me, like he was seeing somewhere else entirely. Somewhere inside his own head where all his memories were being carefully filed away, cataloged, consumed by something that fed on them. I could almost see the moment the thing inside the fog found something precious, a childhood memory perhaps, or a moment of love, and pulled it down into darkness. His laughter became a gasp, his legs buckled. Derek caught him before he fell, tried to hold him upright. He was shouting now, no longer careful about being quiet. "Stay with me, man. Stay with me. Look at me." But the man wasn't there anymore, not really. His body was still there, mechanically standing, but something essential had been erased. I could see it in the way he moved, the way he breathed. He was a shell now, an echo waiting for its body to understand that the mind was gone, that the person it had housed had been consumed by something older and hungrier than death itself. He turned from Derek with the same blank expression the first man had shown, and he walked to the railing. He climbed over it with no hesitation, no fear, no recognition of the cold water that should have shocked him into some kind of awareness. He stood beside the first man, both of them waist deep, both of them staring into nothing, both of them wearing that serene, empty smile. The third groomsman was backing away from me now, his eyes wide with terror and understanding. He was beginning to understand what this place was, what was happening to his friends. "What is this?" he gasped. "What is this thing? What's happening to—" The fog rushed at him like a living creature. It moved with purpose and hunger. It enveloped him completely, hiding him from view for just a moment. When it cleared slightly, he was standing very still. His eyes were closed. His face was peaceful, serene, blessed, like he'd finally found relief from some terrible burden he'd been carrying his entire life. When he opened his eyes again, they were empty. He didn't laugh or cry out. He didn't struggle or plea for help. He simply moved toward the railing with the same mechanical grace as the others, and he too stepped into the water. 3 now. 3 hollow shells standing in a row, waist deep in the black water, their faces blank and serene, waiting for orders from the consciousness that now inhabited their empty minds, waiting for instructions on how to be echoes, waiting for eternity. Derek was backing toward the helm now, backing toward me. His face was completely white. I could see the pulse hammering in his neck. He was still alive, still himself, still Derek, still the man who had demanded triple money for an adventure, still the man who had laughed when I mentioned Jake's nervousness, still the man who had wanted proof that the old rules were just superstition. I could see the full weight of the mistake he'd made beginning to crush him. "Leo," he said, and his voice was shaking so badly I could barely understand the words. "Leo, what did you do? What did you bring us to?" I reached out and grabbed his arm. His skin was cold. So cold. I don't know why I grabbed him. Maybe I thought I could protect him through sheer force of will. Maybe I thought contact with another human being would be enough to anchor him to himself. Maybe I was just desperately trying not to be alone. The fog moved toward us both then. I could feel it touching my skin, cold and searching. It ran across my hands like fingers. It breathed against my face like a living thing. I braced myself for that same emptying sensation I'd felt coming from Derek, that same dissolution of self. I waited for my memories to start being siphoned away, for my identity to begin its dissolution into the vast, hungry consciousness that inhabited this place. But it didn't come. The fog touched me and passed through me like I was nothing, like I wasn't even there, like I was already a ghost. I watched in confusion and horror as it wrapped around Derek instead. His grip on my arm loosened. His eyes began to glaze over. "No," I said. "No, no, no, no." But it was happening. I could see it happening. Could see the man I had doomed beginning to fade away, becoming someone else, becoming nothing. His fingers released mine one by one. He turned to face me, and his eyes were already beginning to go blank. I could see the person inside them being replaced, erased, consumed. "Derek, look at me. Look at my face. Remember me. Remember Tampa. Remember your wedding. Remember your mother. Remember anything. Just remember." But words couldn't stop it. Words couldn't anchor anyone to themselves in the face of something like this. Words were just noise, just sound waves trying to hold back the ocean. Derek smiled that same empty smile and walked to the railing. He climbed over it with no hesitation, and he stood with the other 3, all of them now waist deep, all of them staring into the black water as if they could see something far below, as if they were looking at something beautiful. I was alone on the boat, alone with the fog and the sound and the weight of what I had done. The gloom had consumed 4 men in less than a minute. It had taken their minds, their memories, their entire identities, and left behind nothing but shells, echoes, things that looked human but weren't anymore, and I was untouched. The fog continued to swirl around me, but it didn't touch me like it had touched them. I was of the blood. My uncle's final words echoed in my mind. The gloom didn't need me. It had what it wanted. I looked at the marsh runner's engine, still dead. I looked at the 4 men standing in the water. I looked at my trembling hands, and I began to understand the full scope of what I had done. The debt had been paid. The gloom had been fed. And I was left standing in the swamp at dusk with 4 hollow shells and the absolute certainty that my life would never be the same again. The fog began to recede, pulling back across the water like it had come, like a predator sated with a meal, leaving only the oppressive silence and the 4 shapes standing motionless in the black water, their eyes fixed on something only they could see, waiting for orders from the consciousness that now inhabited their empty shells. And I was left alone with the weight of my choice, the weight of my greed, the weight of 4 destroyed minds, the weight of my uncle's curse now settling on my shoulders like a yoke. As the sun touched the horizon and the light began to fail, I realized that the hardest part wasn't over. It was just beginning. The engine coughed to life just as the last traces of the unnatural fog were dissipating behind us. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely grip the wheel. The marsh runner lurched forward, and I pointed it back toward Gator's Bend with all the precision of someone steering through a nightmare. The 4 echoes stood motionless in the distance, chest deep in the black water of the still water, their empty eyes fixed on something only they could perceive. I didn't look back. I couldn't. If I looked back, I might see their hands moving, their lips moving, their bodies beginning to walk deeper into the mangroves. I might see them becoming something I couldn't comprehend. The water beneath me was familiar and strange all at once. These same waterways had felt natural when I'd navigated them with Raymond, with the anniversary couple, with the solo angler. Now they felt like the veins of something living, something that was watching me, something that had fed and was temporarily satisfied but would always be hungry. My foot pressed harder on the throttle, and the marsh runner surged forward through the gathering dusk. It took 40 minutes to get back to the dock, 40 minutes of silence except for the engine and my own ragged breathing. The sun had nearly finished setting by the time I cut the engine and let the boat drift the last few feet to the weathered wooden structure. My legs felt like they'd forgotten how to hold weight, but I forced myself to move. Rope. I needed rope. I tied off the marsh runner with hands that seemed to belong to someone else, hands that had grabbed Derek, hands that had failed to save him. Jake was nowhere to be seen when I stumbled into the cabin. I called for him, and after a long moment, he emerged from the bedroom, his tail low, his ears pinned back. He looked at me with those intelligent, knowing eyes, and I couldn't meet his gaze. He'd warned me, he'd refused, he'd known, and I'd left him behind anyway. I knelt down and pulled him close, and he let me, though I could feel the tension in his body, the question in his silence. "I know," I whispered into his fur. "I know, Jake. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But sorry meant nothing. Sorry didn't bring back 4 men. Sorry didn't undo what I'd done. The sheriff's office was a small brick building on the main road through Gator's Bend. Sheriff Dalton was a man in his 60s with the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen a lot in his time, but nothing quite like what I was about to tell him. I reported the missing tourists the next morning, after I'd slept, or tried to sleep, in the cabin. My story came out smooth and practiced, which surprised me. I'd apparently become quite good at lying. 4 men on a charter, engine trouble, a sudden fog rolled in, the kind that happens sometimes in the Everglades, disorienting and thick. They'd been excited, wanted to get photos. The fog got thicker, and one of them leaned too far over the railing, then another, then the other 2. By the time I'd gotten the fog to clear and my bearings back, they were gone. Likely taken by gators, I said. The swamp is dangerous. My uncle had always said so. Sheriff Dalton listened to my entire story without interrupting, his fingers steepled on his desk. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me with an intensity that suggested he'd spent decades learning to read people. "Derek Hollis and 3 friends," he said finally. "Bachelor party from Tampa. They'd booked with you." "Yes, sir." "And in the fog, all 4 of them fell overboard." "Yes, sir." "And you didn't see any of them after that?" "Didn't hear them calling for help. Didn't try to throw them anything. The fog was too thick. And when I heard them, I was trying to get the engine back online, get us out of there. It happened very fast." He studied me for another long moment. "You know, Leo, I've been sheriff of Gators Bend for 32 years. I've seen people die. Car accidents, boating accidents, hunting accidents. I've seen panic. I've seen grief." He paused. "What I'm looking at right now doesn't quite match up with any of that." My heart began to hammer. "What do you mean?" "You don't look scared," he said simply. "You look haunted. There's a difference. Scared people want to convince you of their story. Haunted people look like they're barely holding themselves together." He leaned forward. "So, I'm going to ask you again, and I want the real answer this time. What happened out there?" I opened my mouth, closed it. I could have told him. I could have told him everything about the rules, about the gloom, about the fog that consumed consciousness instead of bodies, about the way Derek's eyes had gone empty, about the way the 4 men had stood in the water with serene expressions, waiting for instructions from something that used to live inside them. But he would have committed me. And worse, he would have investigated, and there would be questions about the still water, and eventually someone would go to look for bodies, and they wouldn't find any because the echoes don't leave bodies. They leave walking shells that answer to something ancient and hungry. "I told you what happened," I said quietly. "The fog, the accident." That's all I know. He didn't believe me, but he had no evidence. No bodies, no crime scene. Just a young man with a haunted expression and a story that didn't quite fit. After an hour, he let me go, but not before telling me that he'd likely be contacting the relatives of the missing men and suggesting that I keep myself available for questioning. The days that followed were a descent into a different kind of madness. Not the madness of horror and immediate fear, but the madness of knowledge. I began to see the echoes. The first time was on the 2nd day. I was sitting on my cabin porch in the early morning, Jake pressed against my leg, when I saw something moving through the swamp. At first, I thought it was a heron or perhaps a deer. But as I watched, the shape resolved into something human-shaped. One of the groomsmen, I couldn't tell which one, moved through the mangroves with a steady, mechanical gait. He didn't seem to be going anywhere in particular. He was just walking. After about 10 minutes, he stopped, turned 90 degrees, and began walking in a different direction, as if someone had given him an order I couldn't hear. Over the next few days, I saw them more often, sometimes singly, sometimes in groups. Derek was among them, his expensive bachelor party shirt hanging torn on his frame. They never approached the cabin. They never even seemed to notice I was watching. They simply moved through the swamp like chess pieces being moved by invisible hands, waiting for instruction, carrying out tasks set by a consciousness that now resided where their thoughts used to be. It was on the 5th day that I found my uncle's journal. I'd been avoiding the cabin's back room, the small office where my uncle had apparently spent most of his time when he wasn't on the water. But I forced myself to go in, Jake trailing behind me with his tail between his legs. He didn't like that room. He'd never liked it. The journal was in a drawer beneath old charts and faded receipts, leather-bound, the pages yellowed with age. I took it back to the main room and sat with Jake beside me as I opened it to the beginning and started reading. The entries spanned decades. My uncle's handwriting was precise and methodical. The early entries were mundane: weather conditions, fish caught, tourists pleased or displeased. But gradually, the tone changed. Entries began to reference the balance, the bargain, the stewardship. The first entry that chilled me was dated to a year before I was born. "Another guide has fallen to the temptation," it read. Marcus thought he could modernize the business. Thought he could skip the tithes, ignore the silence rule, take tourists to the gray sectors. The gloom fed for 3 days. Marcus disappeared into the swamp. Father says the bloodline will always be tied to this place, that we cannot escape the debt, that our duty is not to profit from the Everglades, but to maintain the balance. I do not know if I believe this, but I am beginning to understand that belief is irrelevant. The debt is real, whether we acknowledge it or not. I read through years of entries, watching as my uncle slowly came to understand what I had just learned through horror. The family stewardship. The rules that weren't paranoia, but necessity. The fact that countless tourists had been safely guided through the glades because the rules were followed. And the terrible knowledge that the rules could be broken and that the cost of breaking them was not just deaths, but the feeding of the gloom itself, making it stronger, hungrier, more aware. Then I found the final entry. The handwriting was shakier, as if my uncle's hand had been affected by some tremor. The date was 2 weeks before he died. "Leo will inherit this burden," it read. "He will not believe the rules. He will think I was a crazy old man who let superstition consume him. I see this in him, the same pragmatism that I had when I was young, the same certainty that the world operates on rational principles, that there are no real demons, only natural phenomena explained by science. I hope he learns the truth gently. I fear he will learn it in blood. The gloom is not evil, it is old, older than memory. It exists in balance with this land, feeding on consciousness the way other creatures feed on flesh. The rules are not meant to destroy it. They are meant to appease it, to keep it satisfied with what it has, to prevent it from expanding beyond its territory, to maintain the bargain that our family struck generations ago. If the rules are broken, the gloom feeds. And when the gloom feeds on human consciousness, it learns. It grows aware in new ways. Each person it consumes teaches it something new about humanity, about desire, about fear. The more it learns, the more it can manipulate, the more it can entice people toward it. This is the true danger. Not that it will kill, it will not kill, but it will expand. It will draw more people into the gray sectors. It will create more echoes. Leo, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. And if you are reading this after breaking the rules, then you already know the truth. You already know what the gloom is. You already know what I could not prevent. I write this not to condemn you, but to tell you this. The gloom takes a heavy toll from the careless guide. It will not claim your life, for you are of the blood. It will not allow its source to be consumed, but it will claim your purpose. You are the warden now, Leo. Your life is no longer your own. Every day you must make the choice to follow the rules. Every day you must refuse the temptation to break them. Every day you must protect those who would otherwise be consumed. The debt is yours. The burden is yours. The blood is yours. And the only redemption available to you is the knowledge that by accepting this burden, you prevent the expansion of something that would consume far more than 4 men from a bachelor party. Forgive me for not being stronger. Forgive me for not preventing what is about to happen. The blame is mine for failing to teach you, but the responsibility is now yours. Welcome to the family business, Leo. Welcome to the cost of the blood. I read that final entry 3 times. Then I set the journal down and I wept. Not for the 4 men, though I wept for them too, but for the understanding that my entire life had fundamentally changed, that I would never be the pragmatic businessman I'd imagined. that every day for the rest of my life would be a day of resistance against temptation and greed and the desire to modernize, to profit, to live a normal life. The dawn of the 7th day found me standing on the dock with Jake beside me. I'd made a decision during the long night of sitting with my uncle's journal. I'd read the 10 rules again. I'd laminated them on my old inkjet printer. Not the best quality, but it would serve. I held the plastic sheet in my hand as the sun rose over the swamp, turning the black water gold. Before I left the cabin that morning, I had rung the brass bell 3 times. I had found it on the console of the marsh runner where my uncle had left it. The sound had echoed across the water, and for a moment I had felt something vast and ancient acknowledge the greeting. I was announcing my presence. I was declaring myself as the new guide. Now, standing on the dock, I raised my hand and rang it 3 more times. The sound carried across the swamp, and somewhere in the mangroves, I heard the echoes moving, not toward me, but in recognition. The new warden had arrived. I attached the laminated rules to the marsh runner's console. The plastic would protect them from the salt and spray and years of use. Someone would read these rules. Many someones would read these rules over the years and decades to come, and most of them would follow them, because I would make them follow them, because I would tell them stories about gators and fog and the dangers of the deep water, and those who listened would live. My hand was steady as I fastened the last corner of the plastic sheet. It didn't shake. It had stopped shaking sometime during the night, replaced by something cold and resolute. I was no longer Leo, the pragmatic businessman trying to salvage his failed career. I was Leo the warden, guardian of the boundary between 2 worlds, keeper of the terrible balance. I looked at Jake, who had moved to stand beside me on the dock. His ears were no longer pinned back. He was watching the swamp with the alertness of someone, something, that knew exactly what it was protecting. He had known all along what I was. He had known that I was of the blood, that I carried the responsibility that came with that blood. "It's okay, Jake," I told him, and I meant it. "We know what we have to do now." The sun continued to rise, and I stood on the dock with my dog, looking out at the Everglades. Somewhere in those waters and mangroves, the gloom was satisfied. For now, for this month, for as long as I continued to follow the rules and maintain the balance, but it would always be hungry, and I would always be its warden, standing at the boundary, making sure that it was fed just enough to keep it satisfied, but never so much that it grew bold enough to expand. The debt was mine, the burden was mine, the blood was mine, and I accepted it all. The job listing said, "Overnight Security Associate, Fulfillment Center, Fall River, Massachusetts. $15 an hour, plus a $1.50 shift differential for nights." I read it twice in the parking lot of the Brockton Econo Lodge, sitting in my car with the engine off because running it wasted gas. And then I clicked apply and set my phone face down on the passenger seat. Outside, the lot was half full. A woman in nursing scrubs was loading grocery bags into a Civic 2 spaces over. She glanced at me once, the casual sweep you do when you sense motion nearby, then went back to her bags. Nobody looked at me and saw a problem. That was the thing about civilian life I was still getting used to. People stopped caring what you were. I picked the phone back up and submitted the application. That was a Thursday. They called the following Monday, which I took as a sign of how badly they needed people rather than a sign of my qualifications. The woman on the phone was pleasant and quick. Orientation. Wednesday at 4 p.m, Fall River facility. I wrote the address on the back of a gas station receipt and taped it to the dashboard. I didn't tell anyone. There was nobody to tell. My brother was in Phoenix and we talked maybe twice a year. Sarah, my wife, separated, not yet legally finalized, had moved to her sister's place in Providence, and we coordinated through a calendar app. I had a box of books, and a box of kitchen stuff, and a box labeled Leo, MISC, in her handwriting, sitting in a hallway I hadn't yet found the nerve to visit. So the calendar stayed empty. I circled Wednesday on the free motel calendar by the door and went back to watching cable news with the sound low and trying not to think too hard about the previous 11 months. The facility was bigger than I'd expected, which is saying something because I had expected large. I followed a service road off the highway exit for about a mile until the warehouse appeared on my right, low and wide across a flat clearing. It sat pushed back against an old tree line, dense, close-set growth, the kind of trees that have been standing a very long time. And even on a clear Wednesday afternoon, the forest edge looked dark. The parking lot alone was bigger than 3 football fields. The building was clad in pale gray metal siding with floodlights mounted every 30 feet along the roof line, not yet on, but mounted the way things are mounted when the night shift depends on them. I parked in the visitor section and sat for a moment. The building hummed. I could feel it from inside the car, a low vibration rising up through the asphalt in the seat and settling in my chest. It wasn't unpleasant. It was mechanical and regular and asked nothing of you. I got out and went inside. The lobby was fluorescent and clean. A front desk attendant handed me a visitor badge and a form to sign and pointed to a row of chairs where 2 people were already waiting. A kid in his early 20s with a thin beard he was still hoping would fill in, and a woman in her mid-40s with a lunch bag on her lap and the expression of someone who had been through enough orientation sessions to stop finding them interesting. We nodded at each other and waited. At 4:15, a door to the interior opened. The man who came through it was around late 50s, solid in the way that suggests someone had been large once and the mass had simply organized itself differently over time. Close-cropped gray hair. A face that had the quality of old leather, not worn down but toughened. Dark gray uniform with a security patch on the chest and a radio on his hip. He moved through the lobby the way you move when you've walked the same floors for years and don't need to think about where your feet are going. His eyes found the 3 of us, counted, settled into neutral. "Orientation group?" he said. We said yes. "Silas Black, head of overnight security." No handshake. He said it like he was reading from a roster. "Follow me." The tour took close to an hour, and by the end of it, I had a reasonable mental map of the place. The facility ran on a numbered sector system, 1 through 8, arranged around a central conveyor spine that ran the length of the building. Above the main floor, a mezzanine catwalk extended from the north end to the south, running at about 30 feet up with a knee-high railing on the warehouse-facing side. Cameras were mounted every 30 feet along the ceiling trusses. The break room and security office sat near the lobby on the west side. The incinerator chute was on the east wall, behind the returns processing station. Black walked us through all of it and named things. Conveyor control panel, facilities use only. Camera feeds pulled to office monitors, checked on each circuit. Break room, 15 minutes per shift, not including lunch. He said these things and kept moving. The kid asked if there was a vending machine. Black said yes. I was doing what I've always done in unfamiliar spaces, cataloging details without deciding to. Old cop habit, the exit locations, the angles the cameras covered and the spots they likely didn't. One section, Sector 4, northeast corner, where the overhead lighting was on a slightly different circuit. The color temperature running warmer and marginally dimmer than the rest of the floor, not enough to notice unless you were specifically looking. I was. After the tour, Black brought us back to the security office and gave each of us a laminated card, about the size of a playing card with text on one side. I took mine and caught the header. Overnight Protocol, Fall River FC. Below it, 5 numbered items in clean, small print. "Read those," Black said. "Know them." "What are they for?" the kid asked. Black looked at him for a beat.
This facility has some history with the land it's built on. The protocols keep things running smooth. The kid looked down and read the card. The woman put hers in her pocket. I turned mine over, found nothing on the back, and slipped it into my jacket. "Questions about the protocols?" Black asked. Silence. "Good." He passed out tax forms and badge paperwork, and we filled everything out at the table, and that was orientation. The kid and the woman left at 5:30. I lingered a moment checking my forms, and when I looked up, Black was watching me. "Prior work history says law enforcement," he said. "It does." "You'll want to investigate things," he said. Not a question. I didn't respond. That instinct is a liability here. This job is observation and compliance. You observe, you follow protocol, you call it in if something needs calling in. He held my gaze a moment. "That card matters. Read it before your first shift." I said I would. I drove back to Brockton. The card stayed in my jacket. The first week settled into a routine, and the routine was exactly what I'd been looking for. In at 10, out at 6. Black was always there when I arrived and still there when I left, and in between he moved through the building on a path I never quite tracked. The overnight crew was small. Denise ran the returns processing station on the east side from 10 to 4. Hector did maintenance rounds and worked with the quiet efficiency of someone entirely unbothered by the size or the dark. Terry worked the south dock, a broad, cheerful man whose laugh reached Sector 3 when something struck him funny, which happened often enough that after the second night it stopped startling me. Nobody mentioned the card. Nobody pulled me aside with a look. The nights moved in long, quiet intervals, and I let them move through me. I developed a circuit by the third night. Security office north through sectors 1 to 6, then east to returns and the incinerator chute, then up to the mezzanine catwalk north to south, then down and back to the office. 40 minutes per pass. I did it twice a shift with a desk period between for the monitor review. The mezzanine I went through quickly. The catwalk itself was fine structurally, but the lighting up there broke around the overhead trusses into alternating bands of light and shadow, and the railing was low enough to make itself known to the back of your brain on each pass. Nothing specific, just the general unease that large heights and empty space produce in a quiet building at 2 a.m. I logged it as a quirk of the space and moved on each time. The card stayed in my pocket. I told myself I had read it when I had a moment. Then I stopped thinking about it. I'd been in law enforcement long enough to know the difference between a genuine operational directive and a hazing ritual new hires were given to see if they'd ask embarrassing questions. 5 strange rules on a laminated card felt like the latter. It felt like the kind of thing Silas Black used to take the measure of new people, to see who'd comply without asking why and who'd need managing. I wasn't going to be managed. I pocketed it and forgot it. The nights were quiet. I slept clean and flat when I got back to the motel, a dreamless sleep from 6 until noon, and for the first time in close to a year, I wasn't grinding my teeth or waking at 3 a.m. going over the evidence chain that ended my career. The routine was a container, and I was grateful for it. 8 days in, it was working. The 9th night started like all the others. I signed in at 10, nodded at Black, started my first circuit. Denise was at her station. I heard Hector's cart squeaking somewhere in the 4-5 corridor. Terry's laugh came rolling down from the south dock at 10:40. By midnight, I was back at the office reviewing the camera feeds with a cup of coffee I was pretending was better than it was, and everything on all 60 feeds looked exactly as it always did. Empty aisles, running belts, the mezzanine walkway empty and striped with shadow. At 1 a.m., I started the second circuit. I was passing through Sector 3 at 1:47 when the light changed. I stopped. Sector 4, the northeast corner, had gone wrong. It wasn't the normal dimness I'd cataloged in week 1. The overhead lights had shifted, or something had shifted beneath them, into a color that I can only call sickly. A dull, deep amber orange that was wrong before I could say why, the way you register the pressure drop before you consciously understand a storm is coming. The spaces between the shelving units in Sector 4 looked deeper than they should. The shadows at the back of the rows looked like they had distance in them, which doesn't make sense to write out, but that's what I saw. I stood at the line between Sector 3 and Sector 4. The hair on my arms was up. My hand went into my jacket pocket for my clipboard and found the laminated card. I pulled it out. Standing under the clean white lights of Sector 3, with the amber glow bleeding at the edge of my vision from the right, I read the card. I read it once fast and once slow. By the end of the second pass, my mouth was dry. They weren't hazing. I understood that immediately and without argument, standing there, with that wrongness in the air. They were specific in the way that only experience makes things specific. The way a veteran detective's notes are specific because someone had already been through it and survived and written down exactly what to do. These rules weren't written to test anyone. They were written because someone had needed them. I was still holding the card when the sound started. It came up through the floor first. That was the thing. Not through the air, but through the concrete itself. A slow, low vibration that had nothing in common with the conveyor hum. The conveyor hum was regular and bright and had rhythm. This was deeper than rhythm. It was a groan, steady and enormous, like something very old and very large, shifting weight it had been holding for a long time. It came from every surface at once, and from the center of the building, and it felt less like a sound and more like a change in pressure, the kind that builds behind your eyes when the elevation changes too fast. I looked at the conveyor line running through the gap between Sectors 3 and 4. I watched the belt. The packages were sliding the wrong way. I looked at the card. Rule 1. I looked in the direction of the sound, toward the deep amber dark at the heart of Sector 4. Toward wherever that groan was still rolling out of in long, slow waves. Here's what 11 years on the force does to you. You go toward the problem. Every reflex, every piece of training, every late night spent learning that the sound in the dark is information, and information is the only thing that keeps you and the people around you safe, all of it pointed in one direction. Forward. Toward the noise, toward the dark with the wrong light in it, and the belts running backward, and the ancient weight moving in the bones of the building. I put the card back in my pocket. I walked toward the sound. The lights of Sector 3 stayed white behind me. Ahead, the amber dark of Sector 4 waited at the end of the aisle, and the groan moved through the floor under each step, slow and patient, like breathing. I was still a cop. That was the problem. I was still a cop, and somewhere ahead of me in the dark, something already knew it. Sector 4 smelled wrong before I saw anything. I noticed it 2 steps past the boundary line, a low, damp cold that had no business being in a climate-controlled building in June. Not the dry chill of an overworked AC unit. This was older. It hit the back of my throat with the quality of water that had been sitting in the dark a very long time. My grandmother had a root cellar under her house in Dorchester, and in summer it smelled of cold stone and standing water. This was worse than that. The root cellar smelled like earth. This smelled like something beneath the earth. The amber light was worse up close. From the Sector 3 border, it had looked like a circuit issue. Standing inside it, the color sat just outside comfortable, and the shadows between the shelving units were deeper than the fixtures could account for. I looked down the aisle. Packages in their normal configuration. Nothing moved. I kept walking toward the conveyor spine. The groan was still there, slower now, lower, like something that had been holding its breath had begun to exhale. At the end of the main corridor, I stopped and watched the sorter line. The packages were going the wrong way. Not jammed, not cycling from an error. Wrong way, smooth and steady, the belts pulling everything south to north in full reverse.
It looked almost normal. The wrongness was only in the direction, and somehow that made it worse than any obvious malfunction. I was stepping back toward the break room when I saw the package. It was on the belt about 20 feet down, easy to pick out because it was dark. Wet. It left a smear on the belt surface as it slid past, and the moisture in the amber light looked almost black. The air around it was colder, a localized cold I felt drop by 10 degrees as it approached. I reached out and stopped it. The moment my hand touched it, I almost let go. Soaked through, heavy, the cardboard soft the way it gets after time underwater. The dark fluid on my palm was cold in a way that hurt, bone deep, like plunging your hand into ice water. And the smell hit me all at once. The same root cellar smell, but concentrated, like pressing your face to a drain. I turned it over. The label was dry and clearly printed. Everything else about the package was degraded, but the label was intact. Resident of the Deep. No address. No return address. No tracking barcode. My right hand moved toward the scanner on my belt. 11 years of evidence processing. You find a thing. You document the thing. My fingers were on the scanner handle before I caught myself. Rule 3. I held still. No scanning. No logging. The rule was telling me specifically not to do the one thing my entire career had trained me to do. I let go of the scanner. I turned east and started walking toward the incinerator chute. The cold from the package was spreading up my forearms. I kept my eyes level, not looking up at the mezzanine. 40 feet to the return station. I pushed through the gate and reached for the incinerator handle when my elbow caught the flashlight clip on my vest. The light came on and swung upward. It swept the mezzanine railing in one wide arc and held. Something was there. It was a face. Pale, leaning over the railing, looking down. The pale wasn't complexion, it was surface. The smooth, absolute surface of the inside of a shell. And where the eyes should have been, the skin simply continued, unbroken. No sockets, no features. A face assembled by something that understood what a face was supposed to look like from a description, but had never seen one. There was nothing to see with, and it was seeing me. I dropped the flashlight. The beam hit the floor sideways, and I was already moving, both hands back on the package, the last 15 feet to the incinerator door. I hit the handle, yanked it open, shoved the package in, slammed it shut. Both hands flat on the door, breathing. The cold was gone. Not gradually, between one breath and the next. The root cellar smell vanished completely. The groan in the floor faded back to the baseline conveyor hum. I stood there and counted my heartbeats to 30 before I turned around. The returns area was empty. The mezzanine above was dark and still. The flashlight was on the floor 6 feet away, still on, throwing a yellow circle on the concrete. I picked it up. I did not shine it upward. The security office was 10 by 12 with a desk, a chair, and the monitor bank, 8 screens running 12 camera feeds on rotation. I came in, shut the door, and sat down. My forearms were still cold where the package had pressed against them. The monitors cycled normally. Sectors 1 through 6, North Dock, South Dock, Mezzanine. I watched the mezzanine feed come up. The catwalk was empty. The lighting up there was normal. I looked at the wall clock. 2:58 a.m. The last rule, do not look into the security monitors after 3 a.m. I had 2 minutes. I watched the North Dock feed the way I used to watch security footage at a scene, systematically, professionally, looking for the shape I'd seen at the railing. The clock hit 3 a.m. I didn't look away. The monitors frosted over. It started at the bezels, a white, crystalline film growing inward, and the feeds disappeared one by one. Before the last screen went white, I saw the shapes in the frost weren't quite the warehouse, same geometry but stretched, distorted, like a reflection in water after a stone drops through it.
Then I saw the figure in the glass panel above the monitor bank, the cable management cover, a reflection in it, a man standing behind my chair. Older, compact, in a flat-brimmed cap and brass-buttoned uniform, mid-century postal service. He was holding a bag that moved from the inside, something shifting slowly against the canvas. He raised one arm and pointed to his right. In the building's orientation, that meant south. South exit. Rule 4. I did not turn around. I said nothing. I watched him in the reflection and held still. The radio crackled. "Hey!" Terry's voice, stripped of his usual ease. "Hey, can someone—" "Mezzanine." Static swallowed the rest. I picked up the radio and started to respond and stopped. The voice changed. A woman's voice. Older. The specific cadence of someone I hadn't heard since a hospital room in 2021. My mother has been dead 5 years, and I know exactly what her voice sounds like, and this was it. The pitch, the pacing, the way her sentences always trailed off waiting for you to finish them. "Leo," she said, "just come up." I set the radio down. The voice shifted. Sarah. The slight roughness in her lower register, the particular way she said my name when she was being patient. "It's okay. Just come up to the mezzanine. I'm waiting." I gripped the edge of the desk with both hands. Every rational thought I had knew what this was. The card in my pocket, the rule, the clear mechanics of what the entity was doing, using voices it had learned from my 3 breaches, using them as a lure to walk me up those stairs. My body heard Sarah's voice and wanted to stand up. I held the desk and let the wanting move through me without acting on it. The radio said my name one more time in her voice and went quiet. I sat in the silence. The frost on the monitors had stopped spreading. In the reflection above the screens, the figure in the postal uniform was gone. Cap, bag, buttons, all of it. Behind my chair was empty floor. I let go of the desk. My hands had gone white at the knuckles. The clock read 3:04 a.m. 3 rules broken in 90 minutes. Rule 1 when I walked toward the sound instead of the break room. Rule 2 when the flashlight swept the mezzanine. Rule 5 when I kept watching the monitors past 3 a.m. I'd followed Rule 3 by about 4 seconds of pure reflex. Muscle memory had nearly beaten the protocol on that one. And Rule 4 I'd held, barely, by not turning around and not speaking. 3 breaches. The thing above me had used each one like a bearing, orienting toward me the way you triangulate a position from signal data. It had the shape of me now. It had my name in the voices of people I'd lost. 30 feet up in the dark of the mezzanine, something without eyes was waiting with complete patience because it had no particular relationship with time and no reason to hurry. I thought about the 3 guards before me. Black had said it without saying it. That card matters. He'd said it with the flatness of someone who had watched people ignore it before and had watched what came next. 3 times. 3 overnight guards who had not, in the end, survived the instruction to take it seriously. I'd treated it as hazing. I'd applied the framework that worked for 11 years. Assess the situation, identify the pattern, document, and report. Every single tool I had was wrong for this. Not the situation, not the entity. Me. My tools were wrong. I sat with that. Then I straightened up, turned on the desk lamp, and opened the top drawer. The emergency kit was where I'd seen it since my first week. A red plastic box with standard first responder contents, and along the back of the drawer, 4 road flares banded with a rubber band. I pulled them out and set them on the desk. Flares wouldn't do anything to the thing on the mezzanine directly. Nothing on the card suggested light repelled it. But light was real. Light was the physical insistence of the normal world operating on its normal terms, and whatever the logos was, it existed in the places the normal world left gaps. The flares were a last resort. I put 2 in my vest pocket and held 2. Then I looked at the frosted monitors and the silent radio and thought about what the remaining rules were actually telling me to do. Rule 4 was the one I'd just held by staying seated. The postal worker, the figure in the reflection, not a fix, a hold. It would need completing. Rule 1 was where everything had started to go wrong. 20 minutes in the break room. The card was specific about the time. Exactly 20 minutes, not 15, not 30. The specificity of a ritual, not the vagueness of a suggestion. I understood, sitting there, that I hadn't yet earned those 20 minutes. The sequence had to complete in order. There were things that needed to happen before the break room would mean anything. Going now would just be hiding. I stood up. I put the flashlight in my vest, off. I opened the office door and stepped out. The floor was loud, the full reverse of the conveyor system, the entire length of the facility, running a rhythm the building wasn't designed for. I stood in the doorway and let my eyes adjust. There was a figure standing between sectors 2 and 3, 60 feet away, flat-brimmed cap, brass buttons catching the amber light, the mailbag at his side moving slowly from within. I raised my right arm and pointed south. He held still for a moment. Then he turned and walked toward the south wall, and between one step and the next he was gone. Not around a corner, simply gone. The aisle empty. The conveyor belts ground to a halt. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I'd heard all night. I stood in the doorway and held still in that silence, and understood that the worst of it was still ahead and that it was mine to walk into alone. I gripped the unlit flare in my right hand. Then I turned off the desk lamp behind me and started walking toward the mezzanine stairs. The radio on the desk was still. The frosted monitors glowed faint white in the empty office behind me. My footsteps on the concrete were the only sound left in the building. It wasn't a prank. It wasn't a hazing ritual, and it wasn't a breakdown, and it wasn't the stress of 11 months catching up to me in the quiet of a large building at 3 a.m. This was a hunt, and I had just spent 90 minutes telling the hunter exactly where I was. The mezzanine stairs were a straight metal flight at the north end of the main floor, 12 steps up to a landing, and then the catwalk running south from there. I'd walked them twice per shift every night for 9 days without thinking about them. They were just part of the circuit, the same as every other section of the building. I stood at the bottom of them now and looked up. The strip lighting along the catwalk was running normally, same color temperature as the main floor, no amber, no dimming. It looked exactly the way it looked on every other night of my first week here. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. The normalcy of it felt deliberate. The way a room looks right before you realize something in it is wrong. I had the unlit flare in my right hand. The flashlight was back in my vest, off. Rule 2 was already broken. I'd done that in the returns area when my elbow caught the clip. Breaking it a second time wasn't going to change anything. I put my left hand on the railing and started up. The trick with the watch I'd learned in my 3rd year on the force from an older detective named Carver, who talked about procedure the way other people talked about weather, constantly and without prompting. He told me once that the crystal face of an analog watch made a crude mirror. Hold it at the right angle, and you could see around a door frame or a corner without putting your head past the edge. The reflection was small and curved, and you couldn't make out fine details, but you could see shapes and movement, which was usually all you needed. I'd used it maybe a dozen times over 11 years, mostly in building searches, usually in the dark. At the top of the stairs, I stopped and stood on the landing. The catwalk ran away from me in a straight line to the south wall, maybe 80 feet. The railing on the right side opened to the main floor, 30 feet below. I unstrapped the watch from my wrist, tilted it in my hand until I had the angle, and held it up at chest height to catch the reflection of the catwalk ahead of me. The image was small, a compressed strip of grating and railing curved at the edges from the crystal. I adjusted the angle slowly. I found the face about 40 feet down. It was crouched near the knee-high railing on the right side, folded in a way that made the joints look arranged differently than mine. The face was turned toward the stairs, toward me. That smooth, pale surface, the continuous unbroken skin over where eyes would sit, catching the strip lighting and giving back a flat white reflection with no depth in it. It wasn't moving. I kept still. I looked at the small, curved image and made myself breathe and think. It was near the railing. That railing ran the full length of the catwalk and mounted to the wall at the catwalk midpoint, roughly 45 feet from where I stood, was a red box I'd noted during the orientation tour and filed away without thinking about it again. Manual override for the fire suppression system. I'd seen the specs on a laminated sheet in the break room, the one on the wall next to the shift schedule that nobody reads. Total suppression in under 30 seconds from lever activation, chemical foam from the ceiling heads, full coverage. Whatever the logos was, it lived in the quiet and the dark and the spaces where the real world went soft and left gaps. A blast of foam and noise and cold water from every ceiling head at once was the opposite of that. It was the ward made into a weapon. The panel was 45 feet down the catwalk. The entity was crouched 5 feet past it, between the panel and the south wall. I started moving, watch held at chest height, eyes on the small, curved reflection, not looking directly at the thing, not looking at the railing, not raising the flashlight. Just the image in the crystal and my footsteps on the metal grating, which were louder than I wanted, but there was nothing to be done about that. 20 feet in, the cold started. It was different from the cold of the package, broader, a general drop in the air temperature that came with proximity to the thing rather than to what it had touched. The root cellar smell came in a few steps after, faint at first and then stronger, that specific ancient standing water smell I now recognized without needing to think about what it meant. It had known I was here since the stairs. It was patient in a way that had nothing to do with willpower. In the watch reflection, I saw it shift. Not stand. Adjust. The posture changed, the folded shape against the railing realigning, the head moving fractionally toward me, the smooth surface catching the strip light at a new angle. 30 feet in. The panel was 15 feet ahead. The thing was 25 feet beyond it. I was closing the distance, and it was tracking me without moving, orienting in the way a predator orients when it knows the prey is coming and sees no reason to hurry. I thought about the voices on the radio, my mother's voice, Sarah's voice, each one accurate enough that for one moment, just one, my body had believed it. It had spent my 3 breaches learning the shape of me, what I cared about, what I was afraid of losing. The entity was a good hunter. I could acknowledge that without letting it mean anything. 15 feet to the panel. The cold was working into my hands now, slowing my fingers, putting my thinking slightly behind. I kept the watch angled and kept walking. Then it moved, sideways, along the railing. The motion had a quality I can only describe as approximate, like watching something that understood movement from the outside, but hadn't had enough practice to make it look easy. It slid 3 feet and stopped, positioning itself directly adjacent to the red panel on the wall. I stopped too. 10 feet of catwalk between me and the panel. The entity at the railing 5 feet past it. The strip lighting ran between us, steady and fluorescent and completely indifferent to the situation. In the watch crystal, the face was clear now. The smooth brow, the unbroken skin where eyes should be, the lower half equally featureless where a mouth would be. The proportions were almost right. It had the measurements of a human head. But it was like a thing made from a description by someone who had never actually seen a face, and the wrongness of it was in the precision, how close it was to being correct, and how completely it wasn't. The lower surface moved. The skin shifted, folded, and the sound that came out wasn't a voice and wasn't mechanical noise. It was the groan, the same subsonic rumble I'd been feeling in the floor since 1:47 a.m., but coming from the face now, directed at me, pressing against my chest like a hand laid flat over my sternum. I took 1 step back. It slid 1 step forward, toward the panel. I understood. It was cutting off my route to the override. It didn't need to chase me. It needed me to not reach that lever. Herding. An ambush predator that had shifted tactics when the ambush didn't work. I stopped moving back. I looked at the watch reflection one last time and fixed the position. Red box, wall-mounted, hinged cover, single pull lever. 2 seconds if I moved fast and didn't stop. I put the watch in my pocket. I kept my eyes on the catwalk grating under my feet, and I moved. Not looking up, not looking right. The pale shape, a presence in my peripheral vision at the railing, acknowledged, not engaged. Eyes on the metal grid, counting my steps because I had the distance. 5, 6, 7. The cold hit me like stepping into a freezer. The smell was thick. At my right shoulder, something was there, not touching me, present in that way you feel a person standing too close, a displacement, the edge of a presence your body registers before your brain catches up. 8 steps. My left hand hit the wall. I slid it sideways along the surface and found the raised lip of the panel housing. It was right there. Right shoulder, inches, not touching me. I don't know what kept it from touching. Maybe it needed me to look at it first, to acknowledge it directly the way I'd acknowledged the radio by picking it up, the way looking into the monitors at 3 a.m. had given it a line back to me. Maybe the eyes on the floor were a refusal it couldn't breach without my cooperation. Whatever the reason, it stayed at my shoulder, and the groan from it was building, pressing harder, and in that groan, I could hear something trying to form that was not my mother's voice and not Sarah's. The sound the Logos made before it borrowed someone else's voice. What it sounded like was the building itself, in low, continuous pain. I flipped the panel cover. The hinged metal swung up. My hand found the lever. I pulled it. The ceiling came apart. Every suppression head in the mezzanine section fired at once, and the foam came down in a white wall, high pressure, the roar of it swallowing everything in an instant. Not a sound, a percussion. It hit me in the chest and the ears simultaneously. The chemical foam was colder than the water, colder than the cold of the entity's presence, and within 2 seconds, I was soaked through to the skin and completely blind, the foam filling my vision and running into my collar. Then the pain. Behind my eyes and at the base of my skull, at the place where the spine meets the brain. Not the pain of an injury, the pain of a frequency the human body was not built to receive. A silent shriek, 2 seconds long, directed. It had no volume because it had no sound. It was purely pressure, purely wrong, and then it stopped as completely as it had started. I was on my knees on the wet metal grating, both hands over my ears, which did nothing because the sound had been internal. I stayed that way for a moment. Then I took my hands down, opened my eyes, and looked. Foam everywhere. White and dense on the railing and the grating and the wall. The strip lighting still on, filtered now through haze, casting everything in a washed-out white. To my right, the railing section was empty. No shape crouched against it. No pale, smooth surface. The cold was gone. The ancient water smell was gone. What was left was the ordinary cold of wet clothes and air conditioning and industrial foam, which is a completely normal and manageable kind of cold. I sat on the wet catwalk for a minute and let the shaking in my hands run its course. It took about 60 seconds. Then I stood up, found the wall, followed it to the stair housing, and came down 1 step at a time to the main floor. The conveyor belts were still. The amber in Sector 4 was gone. The overhead lights ran white and even. The building sounded like it was supposed to sound. The hum, the baseline mechanical breathing of a functioning facility. I walked to the break room. The clock on the wall said 3:41 a.m. I sat in the chair closest to the door and laid my hands flat on the table in front of me and looked at the clock face. Rule 1. Break room for exactly 20 minutes. I'd broken it first, back at the start of all of this, when I'd walked toward the sound at 1:47 a.m. instead of here. But the break room was the end of the sequence, the ritual parameter that closed the loop. Not a punishment, and not a hiding place. A deliberate disruption of the thing's hunting cycle, a formal statement made with time instead of words. 20 minutes of absence, exact, after everything else had been addressed. That was the ritual. I was at the end of it now. I watched the second hand on the clock. 3 minutes in, my hand stopped shaking. 7 minutes in, the pressure behind my eyes was gone. 12 minutes in, the conveyor hum came back, the normal forward rhythm, the one I'd spent a week learning to stop consciously hearing. It had come back at some point, and it sounded exactly as it was supposed to. 15 minutes in, I thought about Sarah. Not the voice. The actual Sarah. The one whose handwriting was on a cardboard box in a hallway in Providence that I hadn't found the nerve to go pick up. I thought about her for maybe half a minute. Then I let the thought settle and went back to watching the clock. 20 minutes. I stood up. I pushed the chair in. I walked to the door and out onto the main floor. The warehouse hummed. The belts ran forward. The lights were white across all 8 sectors, and nothing moved in the shadows between the shelving units, except my own reflection in a Sector 2 safety mirror as I walked past it. Back in the office, I sat down and looked at the monitors. The frost was gone, every feed cycling normally. The mezzanine camera showed the catwalk coated in foam, suppression heads still dripping, railing empty and wet. Everything as it should be. I took the laminated card from my jacket pocket, damp from the foam. I read all 5 rules beginning to end. Then I took the blank notepad from the top drawer and wrote out all 5 rules from memory. 1 per line, neat and legible, and checked them against the card. I had them right. I closed the notepad and put it in my vest pocket next to the 2 unused flares. The night had 3 hours left in it. I picked up my clipboard and started my 3rd circuit of the building, walking the long empty aisles. The hum was just the hum. The shadows were just the shadows. For now. The last 3 hours of the shift were quiet. I did a 3rd circuit and then a 4th, which I hadn't done before. The routine was 2 per shift, but the routine had been built by a man who didn't know what was in the building. I knew now. I walked all 4, moving through each sector in sequence, checking the things I was supposed to check, marking the clipboard at each station. The conveyor belts ran forward the whole time. The lights stayed white across all 8 sectors. Sector 4 was the same marginally warm dimness it always was on a normal night. Nothing more, nothing different. I noted that on the clipboard anyway, because noting things was the reflex I had, and I saw no reason to stop it. At 4:15, I checked the incinerator chute. The indicator light on the housing showed the interior was still above operating temperature. The package had burned completely. No residue. I stood at the door with my hand on the housing for a moment, and then moved on. At 4:30, I passed the return station. Denise had left at 4, same as every night, her workstation powered down and coat hook empty. At 4:45, the south dock was locked and dark. Terry gone at the same time as Denise. Everything where it was supposed to be. Nothing that shouldn't be there. By 5:30, I was at the security office desk, filling in the night's incident report. I sat with the pen over the form for a while before I started writing anything. The form wanted incident type, location, time, description, action taken. I thought about what was true and what was technically true, and where the line between those 2 things sat on a document going into a facility records file. Then I wrote, mezzanine-level fire suppression system was activated at approximately 0330 hours due to sensor anomaly. System performed as designed. No personnel were present in the affected zone at time of activation. Mezzanine catwalk and suppression heads require inspection and cleaning before the next operational cycle. Recommend facilities team review prior to day shift. All of it was technically true. I signed it, dated it, and put it in the night report slot. The notepad I'd started during the shift was still in the desk drawer, the blank one I'd used to write out the 5 rules from memory and check them against the card. I folded it and put it in my vest pocket next to the 2 road flares I hadn't needed. The laminated card went back in my jacket pocket, warped and slightly stiff from the foam, but still legible. At some point, I made a cup of coffee from the break room machine and came back to the desk and sat and drank it and waited for the clock to reach 6. I watched the monitor feeds cycle through their 2-minute rotation. The mezzanine feed showed the catwalk coated in foam residue, suppression heads still dripping, railing empty. Everything as it should be. I went out through the north dock door at 5:55. The overnight staff used the lobby entrance, but I wanted to be outside and sitting, and the dock steps were there, a short concrete flight from the dock door to the service road, facing east toward the old tree line. The same dense, close-set growth I'd noticed the first day when I'd pulled off the service road and sat in my car and felt the building hum through the seat. It looked the same now as it had then. Whatever had happened inside the building over the last 4 hours, the trees were exactly the same trees. I sat on the top step with my damp clothes starting to stiffen as they dried and my arms resting on my knees. The sky was doing what it does in early June at that hour. Dark blue giving way to gray, giving way to the pale color that isn't night, but isn't quite dawn either. The light coming up from behind the trees in flat, colorless bands. For the first time in 11 months, the evidence locker wasn't running in the back of my head. The internal affairs review, the resignation letter, the drive to Brockton with 2 boxes in my trunk. Those things were still true, still the shape of my life as it was now. But they were sitting somewhere behind me in the quiet, and I was looking at the tree line instead of turning to look at them. At 5:58, I heard a car on the gravel. A door. Footsteps that came past me without stopping and went through the dock door into the building. I stayed on the steps. Silas Black was inside for about 4 minutes. Then the door opened, and he came out and stood at the top of the steps. He didn't sit. He stood the way he always stood, like a man who'd made a decision long ago not to fully settle into any place. "Incinerator's still hot," he said. "I used it," I said. He came down 1 step. "Mezzanine's going to need work. Suppression system triggered. Sensor anomaly. It's in the report." He was quiet for a moment. I kept my eyes on the tree line. "Mezzanine suppression is on a separate trigger circuit from the main sensors," he said. "Sensor anomalies don't activate it. Manual does." I didn't say anything to that. He held out his hand. I reached into my jacket and took out the laminated card. Warped, dried foam across the bottom third. Text still clear on both passes. I put it in his hand. He looked at it for a moment, then closed his fingers around it and put it in his own jacket. "How many did you break?" he said. 3. Rule 1, Rule 2, Rule 5. He nodded. Not agreement, just acknowledgement. The flat registration of a fact. 3, he said. "And you're sitting here. Rule 3 I followed. Rule 4 I held in the office and completed on the floor. I pointed south. He left. The belt stopped." Black looked at the tree line for a long moment. The light was coming up properly now, the flat gray giving way to pale yellow at the eastern edge where the sun was starting to clear the treetops. "You did better than the last 3, he said. I'd been thinking about the last 3 since 3:04 a.m. 3 overnight guards before me. 3 people who had received the same card and had not, at the end of their respective nights, been sitting on dock steps watching June light come up between trees. I'd thought about them in the break room counting the second hand. I'd thought about them on the 3rd circuit and the 4th. I hadn't reached any conclusions. Just carried the number the way you carry a number when it has people attached to it. "How many did they break?" I asked. "Doesn't matter," he said. "They broke enough." He didn't say anything else about them. I didn't push. Somewhere out on the highway a truck passed, its sound traveling clear and flat across the morning air before fading. 3, I said. and it still worked out. Black turned his head and looked at me. Not the flat tally from orientation night, something with more weight in it. The look of a man who has been watching for a particular result and is trying to confirm he's seeing it. "This time," he said. The two words settled in the air between us, and I let them settle. I understood what they meant. The entity wasn't gone. The suppression system had severed its hold on this particular night, disrupted the specific configuration I'd created with 3 breaches in 90 minutes. The ward restored, the hunting cycle broken, the thing back in the deep shadows where it lived when it wasn't active. But next week the building would still be here. The mezzanine would be cleaned and inspected, and the catwalk would go back to looking the way it always looked. The thing would still be there in the negative space between defined places, the same as it had always been. It was eternal. Black had been doing this for years. The last 3 guards were gone. This was one night of something that didn't end. "This time," I said. He nodded and looked back at the tree line. We sat in the growing light for a while without talking. Somewhere in the main lot, the first day shift cars were starting to pull in. At 6:10, Black stood up from the step and went back inside without another word. He'd said what needed saying. I stayed on the steps for another 20 minutes. I kept the job. Not because I lacked options, but because I understood now what the job actually was. The laminated card was not hazing, and not a test, and not corporate policy. It was a set of protocols a building required to function as a building instead of something else, and someone needed to be here overnight to follow them, and that someone needed to understand what they were following them for. I bought a composition notebook from a Brockton drugstore the next day. 5 rules on the first page in clean block letters. A blank second page. The third page was the beginning of a running log. Date, shift, observations, conveyor status, package labels checked, Sector 4 condition, mezzanine. Case file format, because case files were the language I thought in and the tool wasn't the problem, only the assumptions I'd been applying it to. I came in 30 minutes early each night. I read the rules from the notebook's first page before each shift. Not because I didn't know them, I had them memorized front to back within a week of that night, but because the reading was part of the preparation. The same way you check your gear before going in regardless of how many times you've done it before. The act of checking has its own value, separate from whether you'd have remembered without it. The nights were quiet, not empty. The building was never actually empty, and I knew now what occupied the parts of it I couldn't see. The quiet of a normal night was the quiet of the ward holding, the thing in the deep shadows kept in the deep shadows by routine and protocol, and the simple fact of a human presence moving through the building with its eyes forward and its hands doing what they were supposed to do. I'd learned to read that quiet the way you learn to read any place you've spent enough time in, as a language with its own texture and vocabulary. In August, I moved out of the Brockton Motel, found a 1-bedroom in Fall River, 7 minutes from the facility. The boxes from Sarah's sister's place in Providence came with me in 2 trips. I unpacked them over a weekend, put the books on shelves and the kitchen things in cabinets. The box labeled Leo, Am-esque in Sarah's handwriting, I opened on a Sunday afternoon. A coffee mug I'd had since college, some photographs, a Bruins pennant I'd forgotten I owned. I put them all away in their places without making too much of it. I called Sarah in September, not about the boxes, just a call. We talked for about 20 minutes, and it wasn't what it used to be, and wasn't supposed to be. When we hung up, I sat on the couch in the Fall River apartment and felt the specific shape of what was gone, and let it be the shape it was without trying to make it anything different. Then I went to work. Terry still laughed too loud from the South Dock. Denise still left at 4 on the dot. Hector moved through the building on his rounds with the same quiet efficiency he'd had since my first night. Black was always there when I arrived and still there when I left, and I understood by now that this wasn't about shift coverage. The building was the shape his life had taken around itself over the years,
the same way it was becoming the shape of mine. There was a loneliness in that which I recognized from the inside and didn't try to name out loud. Some things are understood without needing to be said. One night in October, I came down from the mezzanine and was halfway across the main floor before I realized I hadn't thought about anything except the circuit the whole time I was up there. Not the railing, not the watch trick, not the pale, smooth surface I'd seen 40 feet down the catwalk on the 9th night. Just the handrail and the grating under my feet and the view of the main floor through the railing gaps and the routine carrying me forward. I stopped in Sector 3 and noticed that and let it register. Then I kept walking. I passed the mezzanine stairs on the next circuit and didn't look up, not from fear, but because looking every time would mean it was always an event, and it wasn't an event anymore. It was the stairs. I passed the monitor bank near the lobby on my return and didn't glance at it because I'd reviewed the feeds from the desk at 11:30 and they'd been clean, and I'd noted that and moved on. The building hummed. The belts ran forward. Sector 4 burned white with the rest of the floor. Somewhere in the deep shadows between the shelving units, in the negative space where the light didn't quite reach, and the camera housings had their blind angles, and the hum of the machinery was a fraction off its usual pitch. Something old and patient and hungry sat in the dark, the way it had sat since before this building was built, and would sit long after the last conveyor belt rusted through. And I walked my beat, and I checked my labels, and I kept the ward whole, and the building kept running. That was enough. For now, it was enough.